Across the ancient traditions of Ireland, powerful figures rise from myth as rulers of hidden realms, forces of nature, and shapers of human destiny. Among them stands Aed, a figure whose very name evokes fire, a symbol of both creation and destruction. He is remembered as a lord of the otherworld and a being tied to the sun, thunder, and lightning, holding a place in Celtic belief, similar to the sky gods of other ancient cultures. Yet Aed is not a single, fixed character. In different stories, he appears under different identities, sometimes merging with greater divine figures, such as the Dagda, the chief of the gods, or appearing as one of his descendants. These shifting identities reflect a deeper tradition, where local deities were woven into broader mythological systems, their roles adapting over time. In some tales, Aed moves across the land itself, drying lakes with enchantments and shaping the landscape through supernatural power. In others, he becomes a figure who can be challenged and even defeated by heroes. One such story tells of his death at the hands of Fionn mac Cumhaill, a legendary warrior whose victories over divine beings reveal a shift in storytelling. These narratives often elevate human heroes above the old gods, a reflection of changing beliefs as older pagan traditions faded and new perspectives took their place. Even Aed's presence appears fragmented, sometimes re-emerging in other characters, suggesting that the boundary between god, hero, and legend was never clearly defined. Another figure tied to this world is Aengus, a god associated with youth, love, and poetic inspiration. He is described as the son of the Dagda and Boand, the goddess linked to the river Boyne, placing him firmly within the sacred geography of Ireland. Unlike the more destructive forces, Aengus embodies desire and transformation. One of the most enduring stories tells of how he fell in love with a mysterious woman seen only in a dream. Driven by longing, he searched until he found her among a group of enchanted beings who took the form of swans. To join her, he transformed himself, and together they flew away, becoming protectors of lovers. This tale reveals a different side of the otherworld, not only a place of power and danger, but also of beauty, change, and deep emotional connection. Over time, however, the portrayal of Aengus began to shift. Later storytellers, influenced by new religious ideas, recast him as a more cunning or even unsettling figure. In folklore, he appears not only as a god of love, but also as a presence capable of inspiring fear, particularly among animals and rural communities. These changing interpretations show how myth adapts, reshaping divine figures to fit new cultural frameworks, while preserving fragments of older beliefs. The stories also speak of legendary kings, who bear the name Aengus, blending myth and early history into a single narrative. One such ruler is remembered as a powerful monarch whose reign was marked by battles, natural upheavals, and the shaping of the land itself. Lakes are said to have emerged during his time, and territories were cleared and transformed under his rule. These accounts blur the line between mythological storytelling and attempts to explain the origins of the landscape, presenting rulers as both political leaders and agents of cosmic change. Another king of the same name is described as a long-reigning ruler, whose legacy lies in the ancestry of great families across Ireland and beyond. His story is tied to cycles of conflict and succession, where power is constantly contested, often through violence. Even his rise to the throne comes through battle, and despite a long reign, the pattern of instability continues after his death. These accounts reflect a world-view in which kingship is never secure, always subject to challenge, and deeply connected to both lineage and fate. Among the female figures of these traditions is Ain, a being associated with light, heat, and the movement of the sun across the sky. She is linked to ancient seasonal rituals, especially those marking the height of summer when communities would gather and carry fire in ceremonial processions. Her presence connects the human world to cycles of nature, reinforcing the idea that the land itself is alive with divine influence. In some traditions, she is remembered not as a distant goddess, but as a figure who interacts directly with human families, her voice heard in moments of loss, her presence felt in the landscape. The arrival of the Sons of Mill marks another turning point in these stories, introducing new rulers who challenge the existing order. Among them is Emergin, a figure remembered not only as a leader but as a poet. As his people approached Ireland, he is said to have spoken words that bound him to the land itself, invoking its mountains, rivers, and forests. His voice reflects an ancient belief in the power of language, where spoken words could shape reality and establish a connection between people and place. War and fate are embodied in figures like Bad Bee, a goddess of battle who appears in many forms, from a crow circling above the battlefield to a mysterious woman guiding warriors toward their destiny. She is part of a triad of war goddesses representing the chaos and inevitability of conflict. Her presence signals not just physical battle but the collapse of order, a reminder that destruction is always close at hand. Equally formidable is Baela, a giant associated with destructive power, whose single eye carries deadly force. His story is one of prophecy and inevitability. Foretold that he would be killed by his own grandson, he attempts to prevent this fate, only to bring it about through his own actions. In the end, he is defeated by Lug, a hero whose victory represents the triumph of a new order over an older, more chaotic one. The weapon that destroys Baela is forged by skilled craftsmen, emphasizing the role of knowledge and creation in overcoming raw power. Other figures represent the land itself, such as Banba, who embodies Ireland in its warrior aspect, and Boand, whose identity is inseparable from the river that bears her name. These beings reflect a worldview in which nature and divinity are intertwined, where rivers, hills, and plains are not just physical features, but living presences with their own stories. Alongside these myths, early Irish society developed its own systems of law and order, known as the Brehon Laws. These were not imposed by rulers, but interpreted by learned judges who held great responsibility. The laws covered every aspect of life, from social status and property rights, to marriage and professional duties. Rather than focusing on punishment, they emphasized compensation and balance, seeking to restore harmony rather than simply impose penalties. Even in matters of conflict, the goal was often resolution rather than destruction. Bricrew was remembered as Bricrew of the poisonous tongue, a man whose greatest gift was not strength or courage, but the ability to provoke chaos with words alone. In Irish tradition, he stands among those unforgettable troublemakers who seem to understand human weakness better than anyone else. He could hear the faintest rumour, sense the smallest rivalry, and turn a passing tension into open conflict. Stories place him near Lough Brickland in County Down, where his stronghold was said to stand at Dún Rúdréig. Because of his sly, disruptive nature, he has often been compared with other legendary figures of mischief, beings who delighted in discord and who exposed the vanity and pride of heroes. His most famous appearance comes in the tale known as The Feast of Bricrew, one of the great stories linked to Cú Chulainn and the warriors of Ulster. In that story, Bricrew builds a magnificent hall to rival the royal house of Emain Macha, and invites Conchobar and the champions of Ulster to a lavish feast. But generosity is not his true purpose. He arranges the celebration as a trap, knowing that warriors who live by honour can easily be driven into rivalry. By declaring that the champion's portion should go to the bravest man present, he turns a feast into a contest of pride. That portion is no small prize. It includes rich food, fine drink, and public recognition before the entire company. Among the Ulster heroes, such an honour means more than a meal. It is a declaration of supreme status. Among those present are Logair Bwadach, Cumhaill Chernach, and Cú Chulainn, each of them fierce, proud, and unwilling to stand beneath another. Bricriu feeds their rivalry with carefully chosen words. He tells each man that if the champion's portion belongs to him, then the glory of Ulster belongs to him as well. He does not stop with the warriors. He stirs conflict among their wives too, promising the highest rank among the women of Ulster to whichever of them enters the hall first. What follows is a wild rush of chariots, attendants, shouting, and confusion so great that the palace itself seems to tremble. Bricriu has achieved exactly what he wanted. A celebration meant to honour greatness becomes a test of vanity, ambition, and wounded pride. The same story also preserves the famous challenge of the giant who comes seeking honour. This figure arrives after wandering through the known world, claiming that nowhere has he found men willing to deal with him fairly. He offers a strange bargain. One warrior may strike off his head that night, but the next night that warrior must return and submit to the same blow in return. It is a test not merely of strength, but of courage, truth, and loyalty to one's word. The men of Ulster agree that such a pledge must be respected, because their honour demands it. A mighty blow is dealt, and the giant's head is cut off. Yet the creature does not die. Instead, he lifts his severed head, places it back upon his neck, and calmly announces that he will return the following night to claim what was promised to him. When that night comes, the bravest men begin to falter. One after another, they fail to appear. In the end, only Cú Chulainn steps forward to uphold the reputation of Ulster. He places his neck upon the block and prepares himself for death. The giant raises the axe and then, instead of killing him, strikes him with the blunt side. In that moment, the trial is over. Cú Chulainn has proved himself beyond dispute, and the champion's portion is his alone. Then the giant vanishes, as if he had come from another world only to test the truth of heroic honour. Bricriu appears again in the tradition surrounding the great cattle raid, where he is said to have been ill during the conflict. After the struggle ended, he was called upon to judge between two rival bulls, the brown bull of Cooley and the white-horned Finn Benach. Even in this role, close to strife and contest, Bricriu remains a figure of tension. One account says he died under the hooves of the fighting animals, trampled in the violence he was trying to measure. Another story tells that after insulting Fergus during a board game, he was struck in the head, leaving him with a wound that never truly healed. In every version, Bricriu remains what he always was, a man whose life and death were bound up with conflict. Bridget belongs to a very different world. She was one of the great mother figures of Irish tradition, a goddess of fertility, healing, wisdom, and creative power. Fire was one of her strongest symbols, not only as warmth or destruction, but as sacred life, inspiration, and renewal. She was linked with the sun and with the revolving sign later known as Bridget's Cross, a symbol of movement, protection, and seasonal return. She also stood close to the world of cattle, childbirth, and women's care, watching over life in its most vulnerable moments. At the same time, she was the patron of poets and skilled craftsmen, moving with ease between the practical and the sacred. Her name appears to echo across many lands and peoples. She has been associated with ancient tribal names in Britain and on the continent, with rivers and districts in Ireland and Britain, and with places that seem to preserve the memory of an older divine presence. In Irish tradition, she is linked with the world of sacred skill and artistic mastery, standing beside the divine smith, the builder, and the metalworker. Together they form a group connected with creation, craft, and civilized life. Bridget is not only a nurturing figure, but also a being of intelligence, poetry, and power. She is described as the daughter of the Dagda and in some traditions as the wife of Bres. She appears as a woman of wisdom, a seer, and above all, a goddess of poets. Her feast day falls on the 1st of February, the same day as the old spring festival of Imbolc, when the first stirrings of new life begin to show after winter. For generations, this day was marked in Irish homes by the carrying of Bridget's cross, a ritual that joined household protection with the renewal of the land. Bridget also had strong ties to places in County Cavan, where she may once have been worshipped in the form of a sacred stone head, representing a triple divine presence. Later tradition says this object was hidden when Christianity spread, then recovered and given a new identity as Saint Bride. Stories linger that it was eventually removed by a parish priest and disappeared, perhaps thrown into a bog. Such tales suggest not only the endurance of her cult, but the uneasy way ancient sacred things survived beneath later religion. Her sacred flame at Kildare may be the clearest sign of that survival. The fire there was said to have been kept burning from pre-Christian times until the Norman period. It may once have been tended by women in a ritual role long older than the Christian church. And later, it became associated with St. Bridget and the nuns of Kildare. That flame symbolised continuity, devotion, and the persistence of a sacred feminine presence in Irish life. Even the woven cross associated with her appears to preserve a far older sun symbol, adapted rather than erased by Christianity. The related three-armed sign used in protection for cattle and placed above byres and sheds reinforces Bridget's bond with livestock, fertility, and household blessing. In folk memory, she remains not only a saintly figure, but a great mother who guards birth, animals, and the life of the land itself. The Brúidan were hostels in name, but in legend they were far more than places of lodging. They stood on heights, often ringed with earthworks, and served as centres of feasting, gathering, and watchfulness. Their hilltop locations gave them a practical role as lookouts or signal points. Yet tradition also placed them in a more mysterious realm. They were seen as festival halls linked to the otherworld, places where abundance never failed. In these halls, cauldrons overflowed with food and no guest left unsatisfied. Pigs slaughtered one day were said to be alive again the next, ready once more for the feast. Time, death, and ordinary scarcity seemed to lose their power in such places. Certain Brúidan became famous in story. One of them, the Hostel of Daderga, has been connected with places near Dublin, though some insisted it belonged not to the physical landscape at all, but to the realm of myth. Other named hostels were associated with sites around Lusk and further inland toward Athlone. Whether these identifications reflect real places or imagined sacred geography, the traditions suggest that such halls stood at the edge between the human world and something deeper, older, and less certain. Even related words for fairy dwellings hint that the Brúidan was never just a building. It was a meeting place of danger, hospitality, abundance, and supernatural presence. The Cailleach is often described simply as an old hag, but that definition is far too narrow. She is a force of age, wilderness, weather, and sovereignty, capable of appearing as a withered crone or a beautiful young woman. In one region, she is tied to the Beara Peninsula in the far southwest, where she appears not merely as a frightening figure, but as a mother goddess, bound to the land and its people. Stories from that coast tell of contests between Cailleachs who hurled rods or sticks across the landscape, leaving behind standing stones as marks of their quarrel. The land itself becomes evidence of their presence. In County Cavan, another Cailleach is linked to a carved stone head whose lips are shaped as though breathing out wind, suggesting a power over weather and storm. Elsewhere, the hills of Loch Crew were said to have been formed when a Cailleach dropped stones from her apron as she flew across the sky. These are not just folk tales of an old witch. They are stories that explain the landscape by imagining it shaped by an ancient female force older than kings and churches. One of the best-known tales involving the Cumhaill concerns Niall of the 9 hostages and his brothers. They encounter a hideous woman whom they must kiss. Most recoil from her, and some would rather kill her than touch her. Only Niall fully embraces her. At once she transforms into a beautiful woman and grants him the kingship of Ireland. This is one of the clearest expressions of the sovereignty theme in Irish tradition, where rightful kingship comes only to the man who accepts the land in all its harshness and mystery. The Cumhaill, in this sense, is not merely dreadful. She is the guardian of power itself. Cairbre Cathead was remembered as an ancestral figure of an old people linked to the Fir Bolg and to traditions reaching back towards southern Britain. He was called Cathead because his ears were like those of a cat, and poetry gives him not only feline ears, but a cat-like snout. Such features point to a much older world of animal symbolism and tribal identity. The cat in this tradition is not a domestic creature, but a sign of aggression, otherness, and sacred ancestry. Scholars long noticed parallels between this Irish figure and evidence from Wales, especially among the Silures, a powerful tribe whose territory later came under Roman control. In places such as Caerleon, stone heads with cat-like ears have been found, suggesting a local feline deity or heroic figure. Welsh legend preserves the image of a monstrous cat in a way that seems to echo the same symbolic tradition. The comparison has encouraged the idea that Cairbre Cathead belongs to a broader Celtic inheritance, in which human and animal features merged to express power, ancestry, and cult identity. Irish legend adds that his descendants who shared too much of his appearance were killed, as if the divine or monstrous mark was both powerful and dangerous. Cairbre Muse belongs to a different branch of old ancestral memory. He was remembered as an ancestor of the Muskrage and as a poet who won land through his skill. Linked to Munster and descended from notable forebears, he received territory stretching across an important region because of the value placed upon his verse. In these traditions, poetry is not decoration. It is a force that can earn power, reward, and status. Cairbre Muse and his brothers stand at the roots of important peoples and districts, their names preserved in the geography of southern Ireland. Cairn enters the tradition as the daughter of a Saxon king and the mother of one of Ireland's greatest legendary rulers. She is said to have been taken from Britain by Eochaid Mugmadon and brought into a harsh life of servitude. Though associated with royal blood, she appears in the stories drawing water like a slave, humiliated under the jealousy of the king's wife. Even while carrying a child, she is forced to labour until the very end of pregnancy. Her son is born under fear and exposed because she dares not protect him openly. The child is rescued and raised apart from Tara, only returning when he is grown. When he finally sees his mother still burdened with labour, he declares that she shall no longer live as a servant, while he is the son of a king. He clothes her in honour and restores her dignity. That abandoned child is Niall of the 9 hostages. Cairn's story gives his rise an emotional depth, turning the making of a king into a tale of loss, endurance, and recognition. Caoilte, son of Ronan, was one of the great companions of Fionn. He was remembered not only as a warrior, but as a courteous man, a guide, and someone whose presence brought welcome and companionship. In the stories, he often appears as a survivor, a speaker, and a keeper of memory. When Fionn required ransom, it was Caoilte who undertook difficult tasks to secure his release, even hunting strange beings and mastering dangerous challenges. He also appears as a storyteller within the stories, explaining old treasures such as the famous crane bag, a magical object that had passed through the hands of mighty figures before coming into mortal possession. Cumhaill survived the slaughter at Gabra, and in some accounts even fought against powers tied to the sea and the otherworld. Like several heroes of the Fenian world, he stands between human history and mythic memory, a figure who carries the remnants of an older age into the tales told afterward. Cathair Mór was remembered as a great ancestor of the people of Leinster, and as a high king whose reign ended in violence. He was said to have ruled only briefly before being slain, and later tradition traced powerful medieval dynasties back to him. In this way, his importance lies not only in the stories of his life, but in the genealogies that made him a foundation figure for later kings. Through him, the past was used to legitimise the present. Cathbad was one of the most important druids in the Ulster tradition. At the court of Conchobar, he appears as prophet, teacher, and man of hidden knowledge. Some early traditions even make him the father of Conchobar himself. A famous tale tells how Ness asked him what the day was good for, and Cathbad answered that it was a fortunate day for conceiving a king upon a queen. From that union came Conchobar. Such moments show Cathbad not only as a seer, but as someone who understands the sacred timing of events. He foretells the birth of Deirdre and the sorrow she will bring upon Ulster. He also prophesies the coming greatness of Cú Chulainn. Later, when Cú Chulainn is driven mad with grief after killing his own son, it is Cathbad who saves the people of Ulster by turning the hero's fury away from them and toward the sea. He also keeps a druidic school with pupils under him, including his own son. In every sense, Cathbad represents the old learned order, where prophecy, ritual, and political power meet. Césaire belongs to the deep legendary past, to the age before the flood. She is remembered as the first woman to reach Ireland, arriving with 50 women and 3 men after being denied a place on Noah's Ark. In some versions, she turns away from the god of Noah and follows the guidance of an idol that instructs her to build a ship. After long wandering at sea, her people land in the far southwest and move inland through the river systems of the south. The women are divided among the 3 men, while Césaire herself travels westward. Yet the arrival leads not to settlement, but to destruction, for her people are overtaken by the flood and perish. Only scattered traditions survive to say where she died and where she was buried. Different places claim her grave, and ancient cairns have been connected with her memory. In this way, Césaire becomes a figure of first arrival and first loss, standing at the threshold of Irish legend before recorded time begins. The debility of the Ulaid was one of the strangest and most haunting ideas in the Ulster cycle. At moments of greatest danger, the warriors of Ulster could be struck down by weakness, writhing as if in the pains of childbirth, and unable to defend their land. During the Great Cattle Raid, this affliction leaves Conchobar and his warriors helpless, while enemies advance. Tradition explains the curse as the vengeance of Macha, who, after being forced to race while pregnant, condemned the men of Ulster to suffer in their hour of need. Later, writers tried to understand this strange motif by comparing it with customs in other societies, where men took on symbolic forms of childbirth suffering. Whether interpreted as ritual, myth, or memory of some older practice, the tale gives a unique and unsettling character to the fate of Ulster. The strongest warriors in Ireland are rendered powerless not by defeat in battle, but by a curse tied to violated womanhood and the deep order of justice. Cethlen appears in the traditions as a powerful female figure connected with both the Dagda and Béla, and as the grandmother of Lug, who destroys Béla in the great battle of Mag Tuired. Her name survives in place memory, most notably in connection with Enniskillen. Like many figures in early Irish tradition, she exists on the line between goddess, ancestral mother, and legendary queen. Cleodna was one of the great supernatural women of Munster, remembered as a fairy queen, a goddess of the otherworld, and a being whose beauty and danger were inseparable. Her dwelling was associated with a rock near Mallow, and she ruled over the fairy host of South Munster. She possessed 3 magical birds that fed on apples from the Otherworld tree, and these birds had the power to soothe the sick into healing sleep. Yet Cleodna was also deadly. She lured mortal men toward the shore and into drowning, carrying the aura of a fatal enchantress. In one tale, a young man learns her spells and tries to destroy her, but she escapes by transforming into a wren. Her story may even lie behind later customs of hunting the wren. Tradition finally places her death in the sea near Glandor, where the roaring surge of the water became known as Cleodna's wave. That sound was said to foretell the death of the King of Munster. Even after death, her presence remained in the coast itself, in the sea's voice, and in the fear that a great wave might one day overwhelm the land. Conchobar, son of Ness, stands at the centre of the Ulster cycle as King of Ulster and Lord of Emain Macha, the stronghold now remembered as Navan Fort. Around him gather the Red Branch warriors, the champions trained to defend both king and province. His origin is shaped by legend. His mother Ness is central to the stories of power, and in some traditions the druid Cathbad is named as his father. Through strategy and ambition, Ness secures the kingship for Conchobar, and once established, he becomes one of the most enduring rulers in Irish tale. He is portrayed as wise, popular, and magnificently protected by his champions. Yet his story is filled with moral complexity. At the feast of Bricrew, he is given the place of highest honour, seated above the others in royal dignity. But his reign also includes acts of deception and desire that bring disaster. The tragedy of Deirdre unfolds partly because of him. By drawing the sons of Wislu back to their deaths and removing rivals from his path, he secures what he wants at terrible cost. Some traditions even make him husband to several daughters of a powerful king, including Medb, before her rise in Connaught. During more peaceful times he visits Cú Chulainn with Fergus, and is welcomed by Ailill and Medb. But when war comes and the cattle raid, he too is struck by the weakness that falls upon the men of Ulster. In one of the most vivid traditions of his death, an enemy places a hardened brain in a sling and strikes Conchobar in the head. Though badly wounded, he survives for years after his physician closes the wound and orders him to avoid exertion, anger, excess, and passion. Other versions say he dies in battle, while one Christianized form of the story claims he dies in fury when he hears of Christ's crucifixion. However the tale is told, Conchobar remains one of the great tragic kings of Irish legend, powerful, admired, flawed, and always bound to the fate of Ulster. Con of the 100 Battles was one of the most famous high kings in Irish tradition. His rise begins in violence, with the defeat of Cathair Mór and the struggle for control of the island. At first, Ireland is divided between Con in the north and Eogan Mór in the south, with a line running across the land to mark their spheres of power. Later, Con defeats his rival and becomes sole High King, ruling for decades, while the familiar pattern of internal conflict continues around him. But Con is more than a royal figure of pseudo-history. In older tradition, he seems to merge with the divine being of the otherworld. One tale describes him entering a magical mist near Tara and passing into another realm, where he meets Lug and receives a prophecy of the kings who will follow him. His name itself carries associations with headship, reason, and authority, fitting a figure who is both ruler and embodiment of wisdom. Stone heads and triple-faced carvings linked to him suggest that he may once have been worshipped in divine form before later genealogists turned him into an earthly king. In that sense, Con stands at the meeting point of god and ancestor, myth and royal memory. Cormac, son of Art, was remembered as one of the great kings of Ireland, though the stories of his reign reveal a far less peaceful life than later tradition liked to claim. battles fill the record of his rule. He defeats enemies, is driven from power, returns again, and fights across wide regions of the island. At one point, he is even forced into exile in Scotland before coming back to renew the struggle. Despite all this instability, later, memory reshaped his reign into a golden age of justice, prosperity, and wise government. That transformation reflects the way legend gathered around him. He is given a silver branch with golden apples by Manannán, an object whose music calms sorrow and unrest. Wolves are said to have suckled him. Taboos govern parts of his life, linking him to sacred restrictions older than kingship itself. His death too belongs to legend, for he is said to have choked on a salmon bone after turning against the druids in favour of a higher divine truth. Cormac is also remembered as a lawgiver and teacher. Instructions attributed to him preserve ideals of good rule: noble assemblies, attention to wisdom, restraint, justice, mercy, and the keeping of lawful agreements. He is even said to have gathered the chroniclers of Ireland at Tara and ordered them to set down the history of the land in a single great book. Whether or not such a book ever existed, the idea itself is revealing. Cormac became not merely a warrior king, but an image of order, memory, and civilized kingship. Crom Cruach was one of the darkest sacred figures in early Irish tradition, remembered as the chief idol of ancient Ireland before Christianity. His cult centre stood on the plain of Mag Slecht in County Cavan, where he was worshipped among a circle of stone idols, with his own image distinguished by gold, while the others shone with silver. He was associated with grain, fertility, and terrible sacrifice. In return for prosperity, milk, and corn, people were said to offer him a portion of their healthy offspring. The stories speak of fear and horror surrounding his worship. At the festival season of Samhain, gatherings were held and firstborn animals, and perhaps even children, were sacrificed. Later, Christian tradition makes Saint Patrick the destroyer of this idol, striking him down and burying him in a pit. Yet the sacred stone did not entirely disappear from memory. A famous carved stone now in the National Museum has often been linked with Crom Cruach, preserving the shadow of a cult that later generations wanted both to remember and to condemn. Cú Chulainn was one of the great royal and sacred landscapes of pagan Ireland, the ancient centre of Connaught and the stronghold of its kings and queens. Spread across a wide area near Tulsk in Roscommon, it contains ring forts, burial grounds, ditches, and ancient monuments that mark it as a place of deep importance. Rathcrogan rises above the plain as its best-known earthwork, and nearby stand grave sites and pillar stones linked to royal dead. The whole complex is bound up with the memory of Medib and the old power of Connaught. Yet Cú Chulainn is more than a royal centre. It is also one of the great doorways to the otherworld. The caves beneath and around it were believed to reach into impossible depths, and later tradition turned one of them into a gateway to hell. Mythical creatures emerge from Cú Chulainn in several tales. A monstrous triple-headed being comes forth and lays waste to the land until it is slain. White birds emerge and spread destruction by their breath. Strange pigs come out of the cave and give their name to a nearby plain. The Morrigan herself departs from Cú Chulainn in a chariot drawn by a one-legged horse during the Great Cattle Raid. In every sense, the place belongs to both kingship and the supernatural, to the living world and to what lies beyond it. Cú Chulainn begins his story as Setanta, son of Sualdam and Dectir, with royal and druidic blood in his family and a destiny far greater than that of an ordinary warrior. As a youth, he travels to Emain Macha to join the Red Branch and train among the defenders of Ulster. There, he gains the name by which he will be remembered forever. When he kills the fierce hound of Culann the smith, he offers to take the animal's place until another can be raised. From that pledge he becomes Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Chulainn. The name speaks not only of the event itself, but of loyalty, protection, and the ferocity that will define him. One of the great episodes of his early life is his courtship of Emma. He goes to the stronghold of her father and speaks with her in words layered with riddle and hidden meaning, so that those around them cannot grasp what is passing between them. He praises her virtues and asks why they should not be joined. She replies with wit and caution, first demanding to know whether he already has a wife. Their exchange reveals two minds perfectly matched, each alert, proud, and intelligent. But Emma's father soon learns what is happening and resolves to prevent the match. He sends Cú Chulainn away to Scotland for further warrior training, hoping distance will break the bond. It does not. Cú Chulainn returns, storms the stronghold by leaping its defences, defeats Forgall and his men, and carries Emma away. In the struggle, he kills her sister when she rushes against him, leaving the memory of the place behind in local tradition. After much fighting, he reaches Emain Macha with Emer beside him. From that point forward, Cú Chulainn stands not only as the greatest champion of Ulster, but as a figure whose life is shaped by love, violence, wit, loyalty, and an unshakable will. For a young warrior seeking greatness, few journeys carried more weight than the road to Scathach. Her stronghold on Skye stood at the edge of the known world, a place where skill was sharpened into mastery and boys were tested until they became legends. That was where Cú Chulainn turned his steps. Before he reached her, he crossed paths with the daughter of Donald Dornala, who desired him and was bitterly angered when he rejected her. Leaving that trouble behind, he continued until he met Uathash, Scathach's daughter. She guided him toward the famous bridge that guarded the way, a fearful crossing said to deny passage to any man who had not yet proven his courage. To overcome it, Cú Chulainn used one of his extraordinary battle moves, the leaping feat for which he became renowned, and so forced his way into Scathach's world. Once before her, he claimed his place with the boldness expected of a hero. He demanded training, the right to marry Uathash, and a prophecy of his future. Scathach accepted him, and under her instruction he learned the arts that would make his name feared across Ireland. During his time there, he also fought on Scathach's behalf against her rival Aoife, a warrior of equal ferocity. In battle, he overcame her with sheer physical power, lifted her from the field, and carried her away as a captive. From their union came a son, Connla, a child marked for sorrow, long before he was grown. Years later, when that son returned to Ulster under a vow not to reveal his identity, Cú Chulainn faced him in combat and killed him without knowing who he was. The tragedy was complete only after the blow had been struck. Before Cú Chulainn departed from Scotland, Scathach gave him the future he had asked to know. She welcomed him as a victor, foretold that he would stand alone in terrible contests, scatter great hosts, and win a fame that would reach even the warriors of Alba. But her prophecy was not one of endless triumph. She measured his glorious strength at only 30 years and spoke no further. In that silence lay the shadow that followed him through every victory. The tales of Cú Chulainn are filled with marvels of strength, speed, and battlecraft. These were not ordinary skills, but named feats, signs that he belonged to the world of heroes rather than common men. Among the most feared was the Gae Bolga, a dreadful spear associated with the force of lightning. Once he gained that weapon, his deadliness increased beyond measure, and it was with this terrible missile that he later struck down his own son. Another of his astonishing displays was known as the Apple Feat, in which he could keep swords, shields, and golden apples moving through the air at once, never allowing any of them to fall. The image captures the impossible precision that surrounded his legend. Yet perhaps the most famous of all was the dart feat. In one combat at a ford, a dart was sent, drifting toward him through the water. He caught it with his foot and drove it into his opponent's body, where its cruel barbs tore outward and left a wound that could not be survived. Alongside these feats was the terrifying cry that announced his fury in battle, a raw challenge that shook the field around him and made plain that an opponent stood before something more than merely human. These powers reached their height in the great war known as the Cattle Raid of Cumhaill. There, Cú Chulainn stood almost alone, while the warriors of Ulster lay helpless under a strange affliction that left them unable to fight. In that desperate hour he became the single barrier between his province and ruin. The stories credit him with slaughter on a vast scale among the forces of Medb, and even his enemies speak of his acts with horror. When Medb learned that the weakness upon Ulster might soon pass, she sent dark practitioners against him, hoping craft and sorcery would succeed where arms had failed. They did not. Cú Chulainn killed them, as he had killed many others before them. Throughout the campaign, single combats followed one after another, each serving to magnify his fame. One meeting with Fergus mac Roich ended in retreat rather than triumph, showing that even Cú Chulainn could choose survival over pride. But against other opponents he showed no mercy. When he faced Calatin Darna and his many sons, whose bodies and weapons carried a deadly poison, the contest became one more test of whether any force in Ireland could truly overcome him. With help from an unlikely ally within the enemy ranks, he destroyed them. Among all these encounters, none carries the emotional force of his battle with Ferdiad. The sorrow of that duel begins long before the first blow. Ferdiad had once trained beside him, under Scathash. They had shared instruction, hardship, companionship, and the closeness of young warriors shaped together. Yet Medb, skilled in exploiting human weakness, drew Ferdiad into the fight with promises of wealth, honour, and marriage, and perhaps even more effectively with the threat of satire and disgrace. Cú Chulainn was warned that his old companion was coming, but he refused to appear anxious. He rose late on purpose, so that no one could say fear had driven him from sleep before dawn. When he arrived at the ford where the battle would be fought, the air itself seemed alive with dark presences, as though the world understood what was about to happen. Ferdiad questioned the meaning of their quarrel, reminding him of their days together. But memory could no longer undo what had already been set in motion. The duel stretched across 3 days and became one of the great, tragic combats of Irish tradition. They fought on foot and from chariots. Swords rang, spears flew, and each man answered the other as only an equal could. Their skill made the fight seem almost unreal, with weapons flashing between them as swiftly as living creatures in flight. Yet for all its ferocity, the contest retained a strange nobility. At the end of each day they paused, exchanged healing herbs, allowed their horses to rest together, and let their charioteers share the same fire. It was as though friendship still survived in the cracks left open by duty. On the third morning, Cú Chulainn saw the toll the struggle had taken on Ferdiad and taunted him for allowing himself to be driven into combat by a woman's urging. Ferdiad answered with dignity, accepting that every man must one day come to the place where his grave awaits him. The final clash followed in the river itself. Ferdiad wore protection against the Gae Bolga, knowing well the danger of that weapon. Even so, the fight turned brutally against Cú Chulainn, who was wounded so badly that his blood stained the ford around him. At last, he called for the fatal spear. When he used it, the blow was decisive. Ferdiad fell, and victory brought no joy. Cú Chulainn lamented over him, grieving not only the man who had died, but the bond that had been destroyed forever. His own death came later on the plain of Muirthemne, in a battle driven by vengeance for earlier killings. By then, the long career of the hero was closing, and the enemies gathering around him were not merely fighting a warrior, but settling old blood debts. After the struggle, worn out and mortally wounded, Cú Chulainn prepared himself for the end, with the same fierce pride that had marked his life. He drank, washed, and went out to meet death standing. Refusing to fall like an ordinary man, he bound himself upright to a pillar stone so that he might die on his feet, facing those who had come to destroy him. His enemies did not dare approach at first. Even dying, he was too dangerous to trust. Only when a bird settled on his shoulder and pecked at his body did they understand that the life had finally gone out of him. Then Lugaid, avenging his own father, stepped forward, arranged the hero's hair, and cut off his head. Cú Chulainn's head and right hand were carried away as trophies. But his death was answered within a day, when Cumhaill fulfilled a pact of vengeance and struck back for his fallen companion. With Cú Chulainn's passing, the age of the Red Branch warriors entered its decline. Yet in memory, he did not disappear. He remained one of the central heroic figures of Ireland, forever seen as the young warrior in the chariot, with dark hair, fierce eye, bright clothing, gold on his breast, spear in hand, and a presence so vivid that the image seems to move even now. Another figure who stands close to Cú Chulainn's story is Cúroi mac Daire, one of the most mysterious beings in the old tales. His name carries the sense of a hound king, but he is far more than a mortal ruler. He appears as a lord of deep knowledge, a magician, a master of disguise, and a man whose home is never entirely fixed. Though often linked with Munster and a fortress in Kerry, his nature resists confinement to one place. He is restless, always travelling, always appearing in strange forms and unexpected moments. In one tale, he serves as judge in a dispute among heroes over the champion's portion at a feast. When his judgment is rejected, he is described in monstrous form, with bulging eyes and a terrifying appearance, as though insult or challenge strips away the surface and reveals the power beneath. He does not belong comfortably among human kings. He enters their stories, alters their fates, and then disappears again. Cúroi and Cú Chulainn are bound together through rivalry, debt, and betrayal. At one stage, Cúroi aided him in storming a fortress on the Isle of Man, where they seized rich spoils that included a great cauldron, wondrous cattle, and the woman Blathnat. But when Cú Chulainn did not honour the help he had received, Cúroi kept the plunder for himself. His superiority did not end there. He later humiliated Cú Chulainn by forcing him into the earth and cutting off his hair, a gesture not merely of defeat, but of dominance. The insult could not stand forever. In time, Cú Chulainn went to Cúroi's own stronghold to take back Blathnat. She gave him the signal when the waters turned white, and he entered unopposed. Finding Cúroi asleep with his head in her lap, he cut it off and escaped with her to Ulster. But even this victory turned bitter. Cúroi's loyal servant pursued them, seized Blathnat, and hurled both of them from a cliff to their deaths. In these tales, no victory remains clean for long, and every act of violence draws another after it. The fortress of Cúroi reflects the strange nature of the man himself. It is no ordinary stronghold of stone and wall. By night it revolved under enchantment, spinning like a millstone so that no one could find the entrance after sunset. That image captures the essence of Cúroi, elusive, shifting, never fully grasped. He is described as a figure who had travelled far beyond Ireland, who did not stain his sword there, and who did not live from its food. Such details give him a wider and older horizon, as though he belongs to a more ancient layer of myth than the heroes around him. His connections to water, to movement, and to magical transformation only deepen that impression. He stands apart from the social world of boasting warriors and rival courts. He is something older, harder to define, and perhaps only partly absorbed into the later traditions that preserved his name. Beyond the heroes and enigmatic kings stands the Dagda, the great father figure of the divine world. He is the chief power among the Tuatha Dé Danann, a being whose authority extends over knowledge, fertility, battle, and magic. He is not praised as morally good in a simple sense, but as a god effective in every sphere, powerful in every craft, and immense in appetite, strength, and wisdom. Hidden knowledge belongs to him. He knows what is concealed and what is yet to come, and that kind of knowledge is treated as the highest form of mastery. He leads his people, works enchantments, and shapes the fates of gods and men alike. In him, authority and mystery are joined. The stories surrounding the Dagda often combine grandeur with striking physical detail. He is associated with a mighty cauldron from which none leave unsatisfied, and with a vast portion of porridge prepared for him in a way that emphasizes his colossal nature. He also appears in rites of fertility and seasonal renewal, especially those connected with the turning of the year. His union with Boand ties him to the sacred landscape around the Boyne, and from that relationship comes Angus. His role in battle is just as important. He fights against the Fomorians and carries a club so massive that wheels are needed to bear it. He is a warrior god, but not only that. He also represents abundance, hidden wisdom, and the deep forces that sustain life. Even so, the stories do not spare him from death. In one account, he is killed in battle by a missile cast by a woman, and afterward his burial is linked with the great sacred places of the land. There is also a sense that later, writers treated him with caution or silence, as if powerful remnants of the old gods could not be entirely embraced within later religious history. That silence says almost as much as the stories themselves. The world that surrounds these figures also includes ancient peoples whose memory survives in legend and place. Among them are the Dal Naraide, identified with the Cruithin, a people connected with Eastern Ulster and with older layers of settlement in Britain and Ireland. Their reputation is one of deep antiquity. They are described as a people marked by different customs, different ideas of kingship, and a society in which descent through the mother could determine royal legitimacy. Such a structure sets them apart from the later dominant Gaelic order, and hints at an older social pattern preserved in story long after its political power had faded. Their association with horses, lakes, bird omens, and stone symbols gives them an archaic and almost half-remembered presence in the background of Irish tradition. Even when their independence ended, traces of them remained in local names and in the memory of poets. Other figures flicker more briefly through the record of legendary time. Dealbath appears as a ruler whose life ends at the hands of his own son, continuing the familiar pattern of kingship, stained by violence within the family itself. Dealgnat belongs to the earliest age of settlement, when Ireland is linked in story to the great figures of biblical and Eastern chronology, showing how later tradition tried to place local memory within a universal past. Dicorb enters only long enough to die in battle alongside his brothers, his name preserved because heroic genealogy demanded that no fallen prince be forgotten. Dithorba belongs to a moment when several kings shared rule in an uneasy arrangement enforced not only by warriors and nobles, but by poets and magicians as well. That story reveals how deeply political order in these traditions depends on supernatural sanction, honour, and fear of disgrace. At the centre of that supernatural world stand the druids. Their origins are presented in many ways, and certainty is impossible. But in the old tradition they emerge as a learned caste whose authority rested on memory, ritual, divination, and hidden knowledge. They are linked with the ancient Celts of Europe and with teachings that later writers compared to philosophy. Trees, especially the oak, held sacred meaning for them, and their rites were often imagined as taking place in the open air rather than within built temples. Learning was transmitted orally with immense discipline. Vast quantities of verse had to be memorized, and training could last for many years. Their knowledge extended across astronomy, sacred time, moral teaching, and the structure of the world itself. Riddles, formulas, and verse were central to their craft because words were never merely decorative in this tradition. They carried force. Descriptions of druidic practice also include darker elements. Some classical accounts connect them with sacrifice, even the burning of victims in great wicker structures, though the extent and reality of such rituals remain uncertain. More clearly preserved is the belief that they understood the soul to continue beyond death. The next world was not imagined primarily as punishment, but as a place of continued existence, often happy or blessed, where the dead passed into another state. In Irish legend, druids appear among the earliest settlers, attached to the first peoples who came to the island. They foresee destinations, interpret signs, and attempt to control events with storms and spells. When the Tuatha Dé Danann sought to drive the Milesians away, their druids raised magical tempests against the invading ships. Yet even that power could fail. After the Milesians settled, the figure of the druid remained central. One famous druid lit a great fire at Uisneach, remembered as the first sacred fire of its kind in Ireland, and from it all other fires were said to take their flame. Such stories reveal how ritual authority could be tied to the ordering of the whole island. Druids practiced divination through signs cut in yew wands, through the cries and movement of birds, and through charms capable of disturbing the mind and driving a person into restless wandering. Kings relied on them. Before campaigns and judgments, they were asked to name the lucky day, predict the future, or interpret what the heavens and landscape revealed. They also possessed forms of inspired utterance believed to provide the exact words required in a given moment, whether for prophecy, satire, or ritual declaration. Their social presence was equally strong. They were owed dues, observed at seasonal festivals, and marked out by distinctive clothing, often white in ritual settings. At great fire ceremonies, acts of endurance and ordeal could be treated as omens for both the individual and the wider community. Passing unharmed through danger was read as a sign of favour. Suffering harm was taken as a warning. Through such rites, the druids stood at the meeting point of religion, law, kingship, and the unseen world. In the end, they were more than priests and more than magicians. They were guardians of memory, readers of signs, and interpreters of forces that ordinary people could sense but not command. In the heroic age of Irish tradition, no king ruled securely, no warrior fought wisely, and no people understood their fate without them. Across Ireland, Britain, and parts of France, old place names still preserve the memory of the Druids. Their presence lingers in hills, stones, parishes, and ruined sites that local tradition long connected with sacred ritual and ancient wisdom. In France, one place was remembered as the gathering ground of the Druids each year. In Wales, names survived that pointed to Druid stones, Druid towns, and Druid strongholds. Anglesey, in particular, remained deeply tied to their memory, for that island was once seen as one of the major centres of Druidic life until the Romans crushed it in the 1st century. When Roman forces under Suetonius stormed the island and slaughtered the Druids gathered there, it marked the destruction of organised Druidism within lands firmly controlled by Rome. Many individual Druids were remembered by name in later tradition. Some were healers, some prophets, some royal advisors, and some figures touched by violence or enchantment. One was said to have discovered a remedy against poisoned arrows used by invaders from Britain. Another was linked to the spell that caused Cú Chulainn to forget the fairy woman Fionn. Others appear in family lines tied to Fionn and the warrior aristocracy of heroic legend. Some are remembered because they were slain by kings or rivals. One was believed to dwell under enchantment in the mountains of Donegal, while another, serving King Laogaire, was burned at Tara in the age when Christianity was advancing across Ireland. A pair of druids near Roscommon were said to have surrendered their house to Patrick, allowing an older sacred place to become a Christian foundation. Even a great standing stone beside a well at Elphin continued to carry a memory of that older world long after its religious meaning had changed. Tradition also attached druids to mysterious structures scattered across the landscape. Certain ancient buildings and stone remains were explained as druidic houses, ritual chambers, or sacred altars. On St Kilda, far off the western coast of Scotland, one old conical structure open at the top was said to have belonged to a druidess. It had a central hearth and an austere, archaic form that seemed to belong to another age. Until recent centuries, people still treated such places with ritual respect, walking around them 3 times in the direction of the sun. That movement followed the old sacred course from east to west, keeping the right hand toward the light. The act itself reflected a world in which sacred motion, landscape, and cosmic order still mattered. In Irish folklore, megalithic remains such as dolmens continue to be called druids' altars. Flat stones in circles were thought to be sacrificial platforms, and popular memory kept alive the image of the druid as priest, magician, and keeper of forbidden rites. Whether those ideas truly reflected Iron Age practice, or were later inventions layered onto ancient ruins, they show how strongly the figure of the druid continued to dominate the imagination. The druids became a way of explaining mysterious stones, prehistoric monuments, and forgotten ritual landscapes. Tuatha Dé Danann appears in tradition as an early king whose very name carries uncertainty. One explanation says he was called Blinded because he blinded his own brother to prevent him from seeking the kingship. Another holds that the title meant foster son of Deodad instead. Both meanings suggest a world in which family rivalry, fosterage, and royal succession were tangled together. He ruled for 7 years before being killed in battle at Ardbriston in County Carlow, at roughly the same time that the wider Mediterranean world remembered the death of Julius Caesar. Such synchronisms were later used to place Irish legendary kings into a broader historical framework, even when the stories themselves clearly belonged to a half-mythic age. Tuatha Fionn was another early king, the son of Sedna Inurid. He ruled for 10 years and died in battle at a place no longer securely identified. The man who killed him was himself later slain by Tuatha's son, continuing the familiar rhythm of vengeance and contested kingship that runs throughout early Irish tradition. These brief royal notices often appear simple, yet behind them lies an entire worldview in which power was insecure, succession was violent, and memory attached itself above all to battles and deaths. Tuatha Ladrach was remembered as a swift avenger of wrongs, a king whose reputation rested on violence and retaliation. He became king after helping to kill a previous ruler, then reigned for 10 years before being betrayed and slain by an ally who had once shared in that earlier murder. In turn, the killer was struck down by the family of the man they had both overthrown. In such stories, kingship is never calm or settled. It is a chain of revenge in which every victory carries the seed of another killing. Aidan, son of Uige, belonged to the Milesian invasion tradition and appears as one of the chiefs who helped bring down the Tuatha Dé Danann. He is said to have killed Fodla, wife of Mac Cumhaill, during the Battle of Tailtiu. After the Milesian victory and the division of lands, Aidan received territory in the region of Sligo and established a fort near Knocknarea. Yet his success was short-lived. He and his brothers were later killed by Eramon in another struggle over supremacy. Even among the conquerors, unity quickly broke down into rivalry and bloodshed. Eber, one of the sons of Mill, stands among the central figures of the Milesian settlement of Ireland. He arrived with a fleet and, after the major battles that secured victory, divided the island with his brother Erimon. Eber took the southern half, while Erimon ruled the north. During his kingship, he established important mounds and strongholds in different parts of the country, leaving his mark on the landscape through sites that later generations continued to identify with him. But the agreement between the brothers did not last. A dispute over territory soon led to war, and Eber was killed in battle near the river Nor. His name remained important in later genealogical thought, and whole lineages claimed descent from him. He became not simply a fallen ruler, but one of the great ancestral figures through whom people imagined the origins of the Irish. Ecgtheow of Scotland, remembered by the name Horsemath, belonged to a more fantastic strand of the tradition. He was raided by Cú Chulainn and Fionn, who carried off his 3 magical cows. These animals were no ordinary cattle. Each day, their milk was said to fill a great copper cauldron with an abundance that seemed endless. In stories like this, cattle are not simply wealth. They are supernatural treasures, tokens of sovereignty, and prizes worthy of heroic conflict. Ithrial ruled for 20 years before being killed by Cumhaill. His reign is marked less by personal exploits than by the clearing of plains across different regions of Ireland. Such notices reflect a deep connection in early tradition between kingship and the ordering of the land. A good king was not only a warrior, he was one under whom forests were opened, plains made useful, and the land itself transformed for settlement and agriculture. The naming of these plains preserved the memory of that civilizing role, even when the exact places were later difficult to identify. Elim, son of Conra, ruled Ulster for 2 decades before meeting his death at the hands of Tuatha Dé Danann, near the hill of Scrine. He had been one of the provincial rulers involved in the killing of Tuathail's father, and his death is presented as an act of vengeance as much as a transfer of power. Early Irish kingship repeatedly turns on this principle. Blood must answer blood, and legitimacy is often restored not by law, but by successful revenge. Another Elim, called Oilfin's Nechter, ruled as High King and was remembered for a strange marvel. In the year of his death, snow was said to fall with the taste of wine. Such details belong to a tradition that linked the deaths of kings with wonders in nature, signs that the order of the world itself responded to the fall of rulers. Marvels, portents, and unnatural weather frequently surround these old royal deaths, giving them a cosmic rather than merely political dimension. Ellen Trechen was one of the most terrifying beings associated with the otherworld. A triple-headed destructive power, it was said to emerge from the cave of Cú Chulainn on the eve of Samhain and lay waste to the land. This monster belongs to a wider pattern in Irish tradition, where dangerous beings rise out of Connacht's underworld landscape and threaten the royal centres of Ulster and Tara. The struggle between these destructive forces and the heroes who oppose them reflects more than adventure. It suggests a ritual geography in which caves, borders, and sacred seasons opened passages between the human world and hostile supernatural power. Ellen Trechen was eventually slain, in some versions by Emergin, father of Conall Cernach. The story reinforces the role of heroic families as defenders not only of territory, but of the world's fragile order. Eochaid, son of Éire, became king of the Fir Bolg after killing the previous ruler. He ruled for 10 years before being defeated and slain by the Tuatha Dé Danann at the First Battle of Mag Tuired in Connaught. His fall marks the end of Fir Bolg kingship and one of the great turning points in the legendary sequence of invasions. Tradition places his death on the strand near Ballysadara, where his cairn was still shown long afterward. People said the sea itself could never cover it, as though the grave of the defeated king remained protected by a mysterious power. The age of Eochaid is described as one of justice and abundance. No rain fell, only dew. Harvests never failed. Falsehood was banished from Ireland. This is the classic image of sacred kingship. Under the just ruler, the land becomes fertile, the seasons remain orderly, and truth prevails. The king's moral condition and the prosperity of the soil are inseparable. That belief runs through much of early Irish tradition. The ruler does not merely govern the people. He stands in living relation to the land itself. The Battle of Mag Tuath, where Eochaid fell, was remembered as a slaughter on an immense scale. Later, sources exaggerated the number of dead, but all agreed that it was one of the greatest massacres in the ancient legends of Ireland. With Eochaid's death, the reign of the Fir Bolg ended. Their line of 9 kings, remembered as ruling for only a few decades, passed into the background as a defeated people displaced by a stronger supernatural race. Eochaid Magmadon belongs to a later and more recognisably historical age, though legend still surrounds him. He was remembered as the father of Neil of the 9 hostages, and his epithet, meaning slave lord, came from his raids on Roman Britain, where he took captives and brought them back to Ireland. One of those captives, Cairen, was said to be the daughter of a Saxon king and became the mother of Niall. In this way, Eochaid stands at the edge of the late Roman world, linked to cross-channel raiding, dynastic foundation, and the changing balance of power in Ireland. His death is especially significant in tradition. He was killed at Dub Comair in County Cavan by the 3 Collis, and the event was remembered as more than a murder. It was treated as a symbolic break with an older sacred order centred on an ancient pagan religious site. Eochaid appears as a defender of that order, and his killing marks the weakening of the old theocratic structure that had long protected the northern tribes. Later, memory even preserved a curse said to linger over the hill where the crime occurred, as though the land itself held the stain of what had happened there. Eochaid was also associated with a solar aspect. Early Christian observers were convinced that the Irish had worshipped a sun god, and his name may preserve something of that older religious world. He ruled Tara for 8 years and became a crucial ancestor in later dynastic genealogies. The Uí Níl traced their line through Niall back to him, while the Connachta claimed descent through his other sons. In this sense, he stands near the root of several of the most powerful historical kindreds in Ireland. The mixture of myth, religion, genealogy and memory around his figure shows how the old narratives were used to explain political reality. The Eoganacht were the great southern Gaelic dynasty, whose origins were traced back to Eogan Mór. They rose to become the leading power in Munster and built alliances with neighbouring peoples, such as the Osraige and the Siaraige. Their main centre was Cashel, though they were also closely linked to West Munster, especially the districts around Knockany, Limerick and Clare. Tradition remembers them defeating the Arianan, an older and important people, in battle among the hills between Kilmallock and Doneraile. This victory helped define the political shape of southern Ireland for centuries to come. Erimon, brother of Eber and one of the great Milesian leaders, occupies a central position in Irish origin tradition. He led a force from Spain, landed in the southwest, and moved northeast across the island, fighting the decisive battles that made the Milesians masters of Ireland. After victory, he divided the land with Eber, taking the north while his brother ruled the south. The agreement lasted only a year before renewed conflict led to another battle and the death of Eber. From then on, Erimon became sole ruler. More importantly, later genealogists made Erimon the principal ancestor of the Irish. Through him, the Gaelic population traced its own origins and identity. His memory was embedded not only in story but in poetry, where his grave, kingship, and conquest were remembered in solemn lines. The Milesian settlement under Erimon became the grand narrative of Irish ancestry, a way of placing the people of Ireland within a heroic migration from overseas and connecting them to an ordered royal past. Eriu was one of the queens of the Tuatha Dé Danann and one of the most important female figures in Irish mythic geography. She was killed during the Milesian conquest at Tailtiu, where the invading forces overthrew the chiefs and queens of the divine race. Yet her defeat did not erase her. Eriu endured in the very name of the land. Her name became the ancient form of Ireland itself, and in that sense, she outlived conquest and remained woven into the identity of the island. She represented the earth of Ireland in personal form, the land as goddess. Some traditions also suggest a solar quality in her nature. Her imagery includes shining ornaments and circular symbols that connect her to celestial power. Eriu, along with her sisters Banba and Fodla, belong to a trio of female figures deeply bound to the island. When the Milesians arrived and declared that they had come to conquer, Eriu did not beg for life or victory. Instead, she asked for one thing only: that the island should bear her name. The request was granted. That moment captures the enduring force of the goddess. Even when political power changes hands, the land keeps the memory of its sacred feminine name. Etishel, son of Eogan and grandson of Oiliol Olum, ruled for 5 years before being killed by Nuadu Necht at Eilen in Kildare. His brief appearance in the tradition reflects the way many early kings survive only through compressed notices of rule and death. Yet even these short entries are part of a larger system of memory in which each king helps bridge the gap between genealogy, legend, and landscape. Fer Diad remains one of the most tragic warriors in all Irish story. A hero of Connacht, he had once trained in Scotland under Scathash, beside Cú Chulainn, though Cú Chulainn had been his junior. The two had been close companions, bound by shared hardship and martial discipline. During the cattle raid, Medby manipulated Fer Diad into taking the field against his old friend. He did not go eagerly. He entered the combat with reluctance, knowing exactly who stood on the other side and understanding the weight of what was about to happen. Fer Diad wore a famous battle dress, said to have skin as hard as horn. For days, the two champions fought in single combat at the ford. Each evening, when battle paused, they exchanged food, healing herbs, and words of sorrow. Their conflict is not presented as hatred, but as a cruel obligation imposed by larger forces. On the 4th day, Cú Chulainn killed him with the Gae Bolga, the terrible barbed weapon that ended the duel at last. Then he lifted the body and laid it on the Ulster side of the river, grieving over the fallen man who had once been like a brother. The place where they fought later gave its name to Ardee in County Louth, preserving forever the memory of the greatest single combat in Irish legend. Fergus MacRoich was one of the most imposing figures of the Ulster cycle, a warrior king of great strength and passion whose life was shaped by loyalty, betrayal, exile, and divided allegiance. He was king of Ulster before Conchobar, but lost the throne when he agreed that Conchobar should rule for a year as part of his marriage arrangement with Ness. That year never ended. Ness secured the kingship for her son permanently, and Fergus was left as foster father to the very king who had displaced him. His nobility is clearest in the tragedy of the sons of Uisliu. Fergus gave his word that they would be safe if they returned from exile in Scotland. Yet through a geese he was forced away to a feast just as they arrived, and during his absence Conchobar had them killed. Furious at this dishonour, Fergus turned against Ulster, burned Emain Macha, and went into exile in Connaught under the protection of Ailill and Medb. That exile transformed him from former king of Ulster into one of the key leaders on the opposite side in the cattle raid. Even then, his loyalty remained divided. While marching with the Connaught host, he secretly warned the Ulstermen and led his army by a long detour to buy them time. Yet he also advised Ailill on the strengths of those he faced and fought fiercely in battle, cutting down hundreds with his great sword, Caladbolg, a weapon described almost like a stroke of lightning in his hands. During the final fighting, he nearly reached Conchobar himself, but was checked before he could take revenge. To release his rage, he hacked the tops off hills with his sword, leaving the landscape marked by his fury. Fergus was also Medby's lover, and that bond helps explain why he remained with Connaught despite his old ties to Ulster. His end came not in glorious battle, but in a moment of jealousy. While he and Medb swam together in a lake, Ailill, consumed by resentment, ordered a warrior of unerring aim to cast a spear at them. The weapon struck Fergus through the body and killed him beside the water. Later tradition gives him one final role beyond death. When the poets wandered in search of the full tale of the cattle raid, they came at last to Fergus's grave and called up his spirit. After days of invocation, he rose from the mound and recited the great story to them, as mighty in death as he had been in life. Fionn mac Cumhaill stands at the heart of the Fenian tradition, the greatest hero of the warrior bands known as the Fianna. For centuries his stories dominated the heroic imagination of Gaelic Ireland and Scotland. Some insisted he had been a real historical figure of the 3rd century. Others saw him as a creature of pure legend, or as the fading memory of an older divine hero reshaped into a warrior leader. The debate itself is revealing. Fionn stands so powerfully between myth and history that tradition has never fully placed him on one side or the other. His ancestry was claimed by many regions and families. Different genealogies linked him to Leinster, Munster, and several important tribal groups. All agreed, however, that his father was Cumhaill, leader of the Fianna under the High King Con. Cumhaill's fall set the whole drama of Finn's life in motion. After refusing a summons to Tara, Cumhaill lost royal favour and his command was promised to Goll mac Morna. Before the battle that followed, Cumhaill lay with Muireann, daughter of the druid Tag of the Hill of Allen, and she conceived Fionn. Tag prophesied that Cumhaill would die, and so he did, killed in battle at Cnusha, the place later known as Castleknock. From that moment the story of Fionn became inseparable from blood feud. The great inherited conflict of his life was the vendetta against the House of Morna. That feud shaped his destiny and eventually led toward his own destruction. Yet between the death of Cumhaill and the final resolution stretched a vast cycle of adventures. Feasts, hunts, monster slayings, journeys over sea, encounters with women of the otherworld, and confrontations with kings and rivals. Fionn is not simply an avenger, he is hunter, poet, seer, war leader, and the central mind of a whole heroic age. As a child, he was not yet known by the name Fionn. He was called Deimhne, and was hidden away for safety after his father's death. Brought up in secrecy, he was eventually taken to Tara to take part in games. There, his athletic brilliance caught the eye of Conn of the 100 Battles. Impressed by the boy's beauty and skill, Conn referred to him by a name meaning fair or bright, and from that moment, the name remained with him. The naming is significant. Fionn becomes not only an individual, but a figure marked by radiance, youth, and chosen destiny. One of the defining moments of his life came on the Boyne, where he served under a druid named Fionn. The druid sought the salmon of knowledge, a fish whose flesh would reveal everything happening in Ireland. When the fish was finally caught and cooked, Fionn pressed down a blister on its side and burned his thumb. Instinctively, he put the thumb in his mouth, and with that simple act the wisdom passed into him instead. Suddenly, He understood events far beyond the place where he stood. He could perceive what was happening in the great courts of the island and entered into a new level of awareness. When the druid realised what had happened, he accepted that the wisdom had reached the one destined to receive it. From then on, Finn's gift of knowledge became linked to the chewing of his thumb. Whenever he placed it in his mouth, insight would come. This detail reflects an older sacred logic in which wisdom is not abstract learning, but something physically embodied, ritually accessed, and almost divine in origin. Through that power, Finn became more than a warrior. He became a seer whose awareness reached into the future. With this second sight, he was said to foresee later invasions and coming upheavals. He also entered into conflict with kings, especially Cormac mac Airt. During one feast at Tara, tension flared when drink loosened restraint, and older grievances resurfaced. Cormac challenged Finn, and the quarrel quickly drew in the memory of Cumhaill's death, and the long hostility between Finn's people and the House of Morna. Accusations were exchanged. Finn's supporters recalled the killing of his father. Opponents answered that Cumhaill himself had been to blame for carrying off Muireann by force. They charged forward like seasoned fighters, breaking through the path with force, scattering the warriors of Tara and wounding their king. In the chaos, Cairbre was taken alive. His capture forced a moment of humiliation upon his father, who had to submit publicly to secure his son's freedom. Only when both sides performed a symbolic act of submission was peace restored, ending a conflict that had already carved deep scars into their pride. Not long after, another strange episode unfolded. A nobleman of Munster gifted Finn a powerful black horse, and eager to test it, Finn rode out with Caoilte and Oisin across the western mountains. As evening fell, they noticed a house glowing with fire in a valley ahead. Caoilte, who knew the land well, swore he had never seen such a place before. Drawn toward it, they approached and were met by unsettling sounds, shrieking, wailing, and cries that echoed through the valley. Inside stood a grey-haired figure, harsh and unsettling in appearance. At his command, something far worse emerged. From one side of the room rose 9 headless bodies, while from the other came 9 disembodied heads. Their voices merged into a terrifying chant, so harsh and unnatural that it seemed capable of waking the dead. Then the figure turned his violence on the visitors. With brutal force, he killed their horses, carved them apart, and roasted the flesh before them. When he offered the meat, Finn refused, unwilling to break his own code. At that refusal, tension shattered into violence. The fire died, plunging the room into darkness, and a long battle followed, fought blindly through the night. When dawn finally broke, a strange darkness clouded their minds, and they collapsed. Upon waking, the house and its inhabitants had vanished entirely. The truth became clear. Those they had fought were not living beings, but spirits seeking vengeance for a slain relative. The encounter was not chance, but a reckoning. Another tale tells of warriors trapped by enchantment inside a cave, bound by magic threads and rendered helpless until their enemies were defeated. These stories reflect a world where danger did not always come in the form of armies, but from unseen forces, revenge that lingered beyond death, and magic that could turn strength into weakness. One of the greatest conflicts tied to Finn unfolds at Ventry Harbour. While he and his companions were engaged in peaceful activity, word reached them of an enormous invading force approaching from the sea, led by a foreign king. The invasion had been guided by betrayal from within their own ranks. Finn gathered warriors from across Ireland, even calling upon ancient allies who had long withdrawn from human affairs. The battle that followed was immense, lasting more than a year. In the end, victory was achieved, but not without cost. One warrior fought so fiercely that his mind broke under the strain, and he wandered into the mountains, lost to madness. Another encounter reveals the strange and unpredictable nature of this world. While travelling in the southwest, Fionn and his men were approached by a monstrous figure, massive in size, with unnatural features and an overwhelming presence. This being compelled several of them to follow him, leading them deep into a hidden forge. There, weapons of remarkable quality were created, swords and spears of exceptional craftsmanship. When the warriors awoke the next day, they found themselves back where they had started, the forge gone, but the weapons still in their possession. The event left no clear explanation, only the certainty that they had crossed briefly into something beyond ordinary reality. Despite long periods of alliance, tension between Fionn and Goll eventually resurfaced. Their bond, strengthened through family ties, could not survive the weight of pride and vengeance. When Fionn killed Goll's son, the fragile peace collapsed. Old rivalries reignited, leading to renewed conflict between their factions. In time, this struggle ended with Goll's death, bringing closure to a feud that had shaped much of their lives. Yet even that resolution did not bring lasting peace. Finn's own end came not in a grand battle, but in a smaller, bitter conflict. In later years, removed from the height of his power, he was killed by a man driven by the desire for lasting fame. The act was treacherous, sudden, and final. Soon after, the killer himself was hunted down and executed by one of Finn's loyal companions. With Finn's death, an era came to an end. The warriors who had once dominated the land faded into memory, their strength and unity broken. The group known as the Fianna stands at the heart of these stories. Some have suggested they resembled organised armies, disciplined and structured, but others argue they belong entirely to myth. What is clear is that they were not knights in the later medieval sense. They were heroes, bound by loyalty, strength, and personal honour. Entry into their ranks required intense trials. A man had to defend himself against multiple attackers, while lightly armed, and prove his speed and endurance by escaping pursuit through dense terrain. Only those who passed these tests could join, and once they did, their loyalty was absolute. Even their families were bound by this code, forbidden from seeking revenge if they fell. Across Ireland, traces of their presence are woven into the landscape. Ancient cooking sites are attributed to them, as are natural formations explained through stories of their strength. Hills, rivers, and valleys carry their names. Their memory shaped the land as much as any physical force. The origins of some of these traditions reach further back, to earlier peoples such as the Fir Bolg. Their identity remains uncertain, with different accounts offering different explanations. Some describe them as settlers from continental Europe, others as labourers or craftsmen. What remains consistent is their role as early rulers who shaped the structure of society, introducing kingship and connecting authority to the land itself. Their time ended in a great battle against a new power, after which they were scattered and diminished. Opposing forces also appear in the form of sea-born raiders, figures associated with darkness, chaos, and destruction. These beings clash with the more ordered powers of light and life, creating a pattern that repeats across many myths. Yet even here, the division is not absolute. Bloodlines overlap, and enemies are often bound together through family ties, suggesting that conflict is not simply between good and evil, but between competing forces within the same world. Weapons in these stories are rarely ordinary. Among them is the Gai Bolga, a spear unlike any other. Said to strike with unstoppable force, it was designed to cause destruction from within, ensuring that once it struck, survival was impossible. It became one of the defining tools of Cú Chulainn, a symbol of his unmatched lethality in battle. The people who shaped the dominant culture of these stories, often called the Gaels, are themselves part of a layered history. They arrived after earlier groups and established their own language, identity, and ruling structures. Over time, they became the primary voice through which these myths were preserved, linking their ancestry to legendary figures and distant lands. Alongside them existed other groups, sometimes absorbed, sometimes remembered only in fragments. Some were known for their skill in war, others for their connection to specific regions. In certain stories, entire groups are nearly erased through magical or military means, only to reappear later as allies or mercenaries. One of the most powerful forces shaping events in these tales is the concept of binding obligations, known as geasa. These are not simple rules, but deeply rooted constraints placed upon individuals, often at birth. To break one is to invite disaster, often death. Some forbid specific actions, others demand certain behaviours. A king might be forbidden to travel on a certain day or enter a particular place. A warrior might be bound never to refuse a challenge or never to reveal his identity. These obligations create tension, as circumstances inevitably force individuals into situations where breaking them becomes unavoidable. Such a fate falls upon many heroes. A man may unknowingly violate one of these conditions and only realize too late that his end has been sealed. In this way, destiny operates not as an abstract idea, but as a series of unavoidable consequences tied to personal conduct. Other stories move beyond the human world entirely, describing journeys to distant, unreachable places. These voyages often begin with a simple purpose, such as revenge or exploration, but quickly turn into encounters with strange lands, supernatural beings, and distorted realities. Travellers find islands filled with laughter or sorrow, places where time moves differently, and realms where pleasure and danger exist side by side. In one such journey, a leader sets out to avenge his father, but is drawn into a series of encounters that challenge his purpose. He meets creatures that defy logic, witnesses impossible landscapes, and is repeatedly tempted to abandon his mission. In the end, he chooses forgiveness over vengeance, returning home changed by what he has seen. Another voyage tells of a king who is drawn by music into a journey across the sea, where he encounters a land of beauty and timelessness. Yet when he attempts to return, he discovers that time has moved on without him. The world he knew no longer exists in the same form, and he is left suspended between two realities, belonging fully to neither. These stories reveal a consistent theme. The boundary between worlds is thin, easily crossed, but rarely reversed without consequence. Those who enter these other realms gain knowledge, experience, or power, but they also risk losing their place in the human world. Even within the human world, knowledge itself can be pursued through ritual. Certain individuals sought insight through controlled acts of isolation, fasting, and symbolic practice. By entering a state between waking and dreaming, they believed hidden truths would be revealed. This knowledge was not freely available. It required discipline, risk, and often a willingness to step beyond accepted boundaries. Cumhaill was gathering his people in the Boyne Valley, preparing them for a decisive confrontation that would soon erupt into one of the most remembered battles of that age. As he worked, he saw 3 warriors approaching, sons of Tuatha, men bound to him not by alliance, but by a deep and bitter hostility. Knowing he was outnumbered and vulnerable, Cumhaill turned to magic. In an instant, he changed his form, becoming a pig and slipping into a nearby herd, hoping to escape unnoticed. But one of the brothers had seen everything. Brian, the eldest, understood the trick immediately. His companions had not noticed the transformation, so he altered them as well, turning them into hunting hounds. With this unnatural advantage, they drove the herd apart, isolating the one creature that did not belong. Once separated, Brian struck without hesitation. The disguised Chulainn was pierced by a spear. When the wounded animal was revealed to be their enemy, the brothers hesitated. They urged mercy, recognizing the gravity of what they had done. But Brian refused. Fionn, knowing death was inevitable, made one final request: to be restored to his human form before he died. That request was granted. Once again in human shape, he was killed, and the act would not go unanswered. The punishment placed upon the brothers was not immediate execution, but something far more demanding. A blood price was declared, a series of impossible tasks that would test them beyond endurance. They were ordered to obtain legendary weapons and treasures scattered across distant lands. Among them was a spear belonging to a powerful Eastern king, a weapon said to strike with unstoppable force. They were also tasked with retrieving rare apples from a distant garden, fruit believed to possess extraordinary properties. Their journey led them further still. They were to acquire a chariot and unmatched horses from a ruler across the sea, animals known for their speed and strength. From another king, they had to bring back magical pigs, creatures that could never truly perish. A hunting hound of unmatched ability was demanded from a northern land, along with a great cooking spit guarded by mysterious women beneath the sea. Perhaps the most remarkable item was a skin belonging to a foreign king, said to possess healing powers so great that any wound could be closed by its touch. Their final task was the most dangerous of all: to shout defiance upon a distant hill, under the watch of a powerful guardian. Against all odds, they completed each challenge, travelling across vast distances and overcoming every obstacle placed before them. Their success seemed to defy fate itself. Yet the final task brought them face to face with the one who would not allow them to pass unchallenged. A battle followed, fierce and unforgiving. Though Brian managed to kill his opponent, vengeance came swiftly. The fallen guardian's son struck back, inflicting mortal wounds upon all three brothers. Broken and dying, they returned home, carrying the weight of everything they had endured. In desperation, they asked for the healing skin they had fought so hard to obtain, hoping to save themselves, but mercy was denied. Without it, their wounds could not be healed. One by one, they died. Their father, unable to endure the loss, soon followed them. The cost of vengeance had consumed them all. These events unfolded in the shadow of a much larger conflict, one that would soon draw in all the powers of the land. The objects the brothers had gathered were not random treasures. Each one would later serve a purpose, strengthening the forces preparing to face a rising threat from across the sea. In this way, even tragedy became part of a greater design. Elsewhere, another figure rises into focus, a ruler whose story blends exile, ambition, and ruthless return. Forced from his homeland after the murder of his family, he sought refuge abroad, gathering strength and allies beyond his native shores. When he returned, he did not come alone. Armed with foreign support and new weapons, he struck at those who had taken everything from him. His campaign was swift and calculated. A fortified stronghold fell, not through direct assault alone, but through cunning. Music was used to lull defenders into sleep, allowing the attackers to seize control with minimal resistance. Once victory was secured, his power was established, and he took his place as ruler. But his rule would be remembered not only for victory, but for brutality. In one tale, he invited his enemies to a feast, only to trap them inside a structure of iron and burn them alive. The act ensured his dominance, but also left a legacy marked by fear as much as strength. Stories of this figure spread widely, blending history and legend. Some claimed he possessed unusual traits, secrets hidden from those around him, revealed only through strange and symbolic events. His life became a mixture of myth and memory, shaped by those who retold it. Alongside these figures, physical symbols of power also carried great meaning. One such object stood upon a hill, a stone said to reveal the rightful ruler. Those who stood upon it would be acknowledged as kings, its voice confirming their legitimacy. Whether through ritual or illusion, it became a central part of royal authority, linking leadership to both land and tradition. Yet power, once claimed, was not easily held. One king, warned of the manner of his future death, avoided the sea entirely, believing that by doing so he could escape his fate. But destiny found another path. Breaking a solemn promise, he brought destruction upon himself. In the end, it was not a blade that killed him, but the forces of nature and the weight of his own broken word. Elsewhere, tales of loyalty and tragedy unfold through the lives of warriors and lovers. One of the most powerful tells of a woman whose beauty and fate were intertwined with destruction. From birth, it was foretold that she would bring ruin, and despite efforts to control her destiny, events moved exactly as predicted. Raised in isolation, she eventually chose her own path, rejecting the man she was promised to and fleeing with the one she truly desired. Their journey led them far from home, into exile among foreign lands. For a time, they lived in peace, offering their skills in return for protection. But safety proved temporary. Desire and jealousy followed them, forcing them to flee once more. When they returned, they were lured into a trap. Promises of safety were broken, and betrayal unfolded quickly. In a sudden attack, her chosen companion was killed, and those who stood with him fell beside him. She was taken captive, forced to live in the presence of those she despised. Her grief never faded. Eventually, unable to endure her fate, she chose death rather than continue in a life defined by loss and humiliation. These stories stand among the most emotional in the tradition, showing not only conflict and power, but also the depth of human attachment and the consequences of betrayal. At the centre of many of these events stands a figure unlike any other, a being of unmatched skill and intelligence. When he first appeared, he was turned away. Not because he lacked ability, but because every skill he claimed was already represented. One by one, he named his talents: craftsman, warrior, musician. But each time he was told there was already someone who held that role. Finally, he asked a simple question. Was there anyone present who possessed all these abilities at once? There was not. With that, he was welcomed inside. His presence would change everything. He became a leader in the coming war, organizing the forces that would stand against an overwhelming enemy. He called upon every skill available: healers, craftsmen, warriors, and prepared them for a battle that would decide the fate of the land. When the battle came, it was brutal beyond measure. Weapons shattered, bodies fell, and the ground itself seemed to absorb the violence. Yet through preparation and coordination, his side endured. Their weapons were continually reforged, their wounded restored, allowing them to continue fighting long after others would have fallen. In the final moments, he faced the greatest threat directly. His opponent possessed a power capable of destroying entire armies, but with precision and timing, he struck first, ending the threat and turning the tide of battle. Victory followed, though it came at great cost. Even in triumph, there was no simple resolution. Some enemies were spared, not out of mercy alone, but because they held knowledge that could benefit the victors. From them came lessons in cultivation and survival, ensuring that life could continue after war had ended. Across the shifting boundary between sea and land stands a figure both mysterious and powerful, a being who moves as easily through waves as through legend. Manannán mac Lir is remembered as a master of the ocean, often imagined riding across the surface of the sea as if it were solid ground. Yet his nature is far more complex than that of a simple sea god. He appears as a guardian, a warrior, and at times even as a figure connected to the movement of the sun itself. In certain traditions, the sun is imagined as something that races across the sky faster than any horse, crossing vast waters without ever being touched by them. And in this symbolism, Manannan's identity expands beyond the ocean into the realm of light and motion. Stories tell of him moving through the world surrounded by a shifting veil of mist, a presence that hides as much as it reveals. In some places, he is remembered in a striking form, rolling across the land on 3 legs like a spinning wheel, a symbol that would later become deeply tied to regional identity. This image suggests constant movement, a force that never stands still, always passing between worlds. That same quality defines his role in myth, where he appears and disappears without warning, shaping events from the edges rather than standing at their centre. He is not distant from human affairs. In one tale, he forms a connection with the household of a king while the ruler is away at war. During this time, he enters the life of the king's wife, and from this union a child is born, one who carries both human and otherworldly qualities. This child grows to become a figure of transformation, able to shift shape and move beyond the limits of ordinary life. In these stories, lineage is not simply about blood, but about power, inheritance, and the blending of worlds. Manannan's influence extends further through his possession of extraordinary objects. Among them is a remarkable bag made from the transformed remains of a once-living being, a container said to hold treasures of immense significance. Within it are weapons, tools, and relics connected to ancient powers. These objects are not merely possessions. They represent knowledge, skill, and the legacy of a people whose abilities surpass those of ordinary men. Through such items, Manannan becomes a keeper of memory as much as a wielder of power. He is also tied to abundance and renewal. His animals are unlike any others. The pigs he owns can be eaten one day and return the next, alive once more, providing endless sustenance. Through them, the idea of survival without scarcity emerges, a vision of a world where resources never fade. This same idea appears in the feasts he oversees in hidden realms, where those invited partake in food and drink that grant vitality beyond the reach of time. Yet these gatherings are concealed from ordinary sight, hidden behind illusion and enchantment, reinforcing the idea that such abundance belongs to another plane of existence. In other stories, Manannan acts as a guide between worlds. He brings chosen individuals into lands beyond human reach, places where time flows differently and reality bends. Those who return carry knowledge that sets them apart, yet they also carry the burden of having seen what lies beyond. In this way, he stands as both a benefactor and a barrier, offering access while ensuring that such knowledge is never easily held. While Manannan represents movement and hidden power, another figure dominates the landscape through presence and force of will. Medb, Queen of Connaught, is remembered as a ruler whose authority was absolute and whose personality shaped every event around her. She is described as striking in appearance, commanding attention not only through beauty but through the intensity of her presence. Her image often includes a cloak of deep colour, a weapon in hand, and a gaze that suggests both calculation and determination. Her story blurs the line between history and myth. Some see her as a real ruler whose memory was transformed over time, while others view her as a symbolic figure, representing sovereignty itself. Regardless of interpretation, her actions define her legacy. She takes power not by inheritance alone, but through force and decision, removing obstacles in her path without hesitation. Even within her own family, she is capable of violence, ensuring that authority remains firmly in her grasp. Her rule is marked by control, not only over territory, but over people. Those around her exist within her influence, their roles shaped by her desires. She forms alliances and breaks them when it suits her, choosing companions based on her own will rather than convention. In gatherings of warriors, she stands not behind, but among them, directing outcomes and influencing decisions. Even disputes between champions fall under her judgment, and she is known to manipulate situations so that each contender believes himself favoured, maintaining balance while preserving her own authority. Medb's connection to war is inseparable from her identity. She leads campaigns, confronts enemies directly, and engages with prophecy to understand the outcomes of her actions. Yet these prophecies rarely bring reassurance. Visions of blood and destruction follow her, suggesting that victory comes at a cost that cannot be avoided. Even so, she does not retreat. Her path is one of forward movement, driven by ambition and the need to assert dominance. At the same time, she is linked to deeper forces tied to land and fertility. Her presence is associated with the creation of natural features, with waters and landscapes bearing traces of her story. These elements connect her to older traditions where rulers were not separate from the land but embodied it. In this sense, her power extends beyond politics, into the realm of the sacred, where authority is both physical and symbolic. Nuadu and Lug share several striking traits, and in Irish tradition their stories seem to mirror one another in important ways. Lug is linked to the Welsh figure Lud, remembered as Lud of the Silver Hand, while in Ireland, Lug is known as Lug of the Long Arm. Both belong to the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the tradition says that Lug assumed leadership without causing division, even though Nuadu was still living. When Bowler killed Nuadu with the deadly force of his terrible eye, it was Lug who struck Bela down in return. Through that victory, the Tuatha Dé Danann remained supreme over the Fomorians. The two gods are also bound together by their weapons. Nuadu wielded the sword from which no enemy could escape, while Lug carried the irresistible spear. These were counted among the great treasures brought to Ireland by the Tuatha Dé Danann. The names of Nuadu and Lug appear across the Celtic world in related forms, showing how deeply rooted these figures were in Britain and Ireland alike. Lug survives in forms such as Lud, while Nuadu appears beside names like Nodons and Nodens. The Welsh Lud is tied to the British god Nud. In turn, the Irish Nuadu is often linked with Nodens, whose best-known sanctuary stood at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire. Because sea creatures appear in the mosaics there, some have imagined him as a god of the sea. Others tried to explain his silver arm as a poetic image for a narrow strip of shining water between islands. Some believed he had a special connection with wealth, especially cattle. Yet many of these ideas remain uncertain, and the evidence does not firmly settle his character. In early Irish tradition, some accounts even treat Nuadu as an ancestor of the Irish themselves. Other traditions place different royal kindreds under his line, including the Ioganacht, the Dalriata, the Ulaid, the Lagin, and the Osraige. Ogam was an old system of writing in which letters were formed by sets of straight strokes, placed in different positions along a central line. It was first meant to be cut into upright stones. The alphabet contained 20 letters, along with 5 additional vowel combinations. The marks were grouped in sets of 5, which has led some to think that the system may once have had some connection to hand signs. Many scholars believe the script may have roots before the coming of Christianity. It appears to have been an Irish creation and flourished most strongly in Ireland between the 5th and 8th centuries, though some families of stone carvers continued to use it much later. One theory argued that Ogam came from a northern Italian form of the Greek alphabet, and that it was once used as a secret code, perhaps linked to systems of signal or gesture. Others preferred to see it as based more directly on the Roman alphabet. In Ireland, it was often thought to have served magical, hidden, or restricted purposes before becoming more openly used for memorial inscriptions. As the old religion faded, the finger signs associated with it may have survived as a secret language before finally settling into use on stones that mark the dead. Ogham was remembered as an ancient and hidden form of writing, and it may have served purposes beyond funerary memorials. Some believed these stones could mark boundaries between lands and stand as lasting witnesses in disputes over territory. Others suggested that agreements such as land transfers may at times have been recorded in this form. The greatest numbers of Ogham stones are found in Kerry and Cork, which strongly suggests that the script first took shape in the southwest of Ireland. From there, it spread outward. In Wales, especially Pembrokeshire, Ogham stones appear in places long associated with Irish settlement and raiding. Smaller numbers are found in Devon and Cornwall, and the script also reached the Isle of Man and parts of Scotland. It is generally believed that the Picts learned it through contact with Irish settlers. One example is found at Cú Chulainn, where inscriptions appear on the lintel of a cave-like structure. Another early Christian inscription from Ballintaggart near Dingle includes an Ogham text interpreted as naming a son of Efrit. Efrit was remembered as a monk from England who came to study in Ireland, and the stone seems to have marked his presence rather than his burial. Even in the 19th century, the old script had not entirely vanished. At Aheny in County Tipperary, an Ogham inscription written in 2 horizontal lines records that beneath the stone lay Mary Dempsey of Ballycrana. In this way, a script born in the distant past lingered into modern memory. Ogma was one of the great champions of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and stood beside Lug and the Dagda as one of their foremost heroic figures. He was the son of Elathan, and the many Sidi or mound dwellings of the divine race were said to have been divided among these 3 by the Dagda himself. Ogma married Etan, daughter of Diancecht, the god of healing. Among his sons was Tuiren, whose own sons later killed Lug's father. Another son, Caerpre, became the poet of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and is credited with what tradition calls the first satire in Ireland, aimed at Bress. That biting verse ended with a curse on Braze's hospitality, and helped stir the Tuatha Dé Danann toward revolt against Fomorian oppression. At one point, Ogma entered a contest of strength with Lug, and Lug defeated him by hurling a great flagstone out through the entrance of a fort. In the Second Battle of Mag Tuaird, some accounts say Ogma killed Indech, a leader among the Fomorians. Other versions reverse the story and say that Ogma himself fell to Indech. There is also a tradition that both were slain in the same clash. Since Ogma was closely linked through marriage to Diancecht's healing line, later imagination could easily picture him restored by the healing well and the spells of that divine household. After the battle, Ogma joined Lug and the Dagda in pursuing the fleeing Fomorians in order to recover the Dagda's harp. His sword was said to recount the deeds of battle and the violence of combat, which made Ogma more than a simple warrior. He stood for the union of strength and speech, the fighter whose power lived equally in words. He became the patron of eloquence, learning and literature, and tradition remembered him as the inventor of Ogham. He was also called honey-tongued, a name that reflects the sweetness and force of persuasive speech. Another title gave him a radiant, sun-like face, which links him to the Gaulish god Ogmios. That connection reaches beyond Ireland. A figure found on pottery from Richborough in Kent seems to show a deity with long curling hair and rays issuing from the head. This figure bears the whip associated with the unconquered sun and is accompanied by a name that points toward Ogmios. Classical writers described Ogmios wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club, but what made him truly powerful was not brute force alone. His special emblem was a chain joining his tongue to the ears of those who listened. the image is clear and memorable. He conquered not by violence only, but by speech that bound people to him. In both Irish and continental tradition, this makes Ogma or Ogmios the divine master of language, persuasion, and inspired utterance. A verse places Ogma in his resting place within the otherworld and sets him alongside other great figures of divine Ireland. Nuadu is said to rest in one famous stronghold, while Ogma lies in his own cedar, and the Dagda, once the mighty central figure, fades into the background as younger powers rise around him. In this way, Ogma remains one of those old divine presences whose strength endured in memory, long after their world had passed into legend. The fate of the children of Lear was counted among the three great sorrowful tales of Ireland. The others were the story of the sons of Uisneach and the fate of the children of Tuatha. The tale of Lear's children is one of the great medieval romances in Gaelic tradition, blending prose and verse in a moving pattern that deepens the tragedy. It tells of love, jealousy, exile, and the slow passing of centuries. Lear first lost his wife and afterward married Aib, the daughter of Bodb, king of Connacht. She bore him 4 children. First came the twins Fionnuala and Aod, and later Fiachra and Con. But Eabba died, and in his grief Lear was persuaded by his father-in-law to marry again, this time taking Eabba's sister Aoife as his wife. What began as a union meant to heal sorrow became the beginning of disaster. Aoife grew jealous of the love Lear gave to his children and of the affection they inspired in others. Her envy consumed her until it became a sickness within her. Unable to bear it, she summoned a druid for counsel. She then took the children away to Loch Derravara in Westmeath, intending that her charioteer should kill them. He refused to carry out such a deed. So Aoife herself drove them into the waters of the lake and with a druidic wand transformed them into swans. When Lear learned what had happened, he answered her cruelty with his own curse, turning Aoife into a grey vulture condemned to dwell forever in the cold and restless air. For 300 years the children remained on Loch Derravara. Then they were driven onward to the Sea of Moyle, the strait between Ireland and Scotland. There, Fionnuala, the eldest, became the voice of their sorrow, singing of departure, loss, and the grief of leaving father and homeland behind. The sea became their prison, and winter their companion. Another lament places her shielding her brothers beneath her wings as snow and icy spray beat against them. The songs make clear that their suffering was not only magical exile, but a long endurance of hunger, storm, loneliness, and cold. Bodb sons Fergus and Aed went searching for them, leading a company of the Tuatha Dé Danann, until at last they found the swans on the waters of Moyle. When they returned to Lear and Bodb, they could only report that the children still lived, but under a misery beyond words. In time, another 300 years passed, and the children were driven westward again, this time to the wild coastlands off Mayo. There too, Fionnuala gave voice to their weariness, and to the endless battering of sea and wind. The passing of centuries in the story feels both immense and intimate, measured not by kings and battles, but by weather, pain, and remembrance. At last, they reached the western island where the end of their enchantment drew near. There, they encountered Ebric, who in later tradition was said to have written down their story. From there, they went on to Innisglua, where their long suffering finally ended. The swan form fell away, and they died once more as human beings. Their burial place was remembered with Fionnuala in the centre and her 3 brothers around her. Tradition identified this grave with 4 standing stones beside a well on the island. The story preserves a sorrow so deep that landscape itself seems to hold the memory. Oilil Olam was originally called Eongus Olam, but the name by which he was remembered came from the violence and disgrace that marked his life. After he assaulted Aine, daughter of Eogabaal, she tore off his ear in vengeance, both for the attack upon her and for his part in her father's death. From that act, he took the name that marked his deformity. His mutilation was not limited to the ear. His teeth turned black and his breath became foul, so that his body carried outward signs of guilt and corruption. He answered Aine's resistance with murder, driving his spear through her body and into the earth itself. Yet despite this darkness, tradition also remembered him as the father of 19 sons. 9 of them by Sadb, daughter of Conn. In Old verse he appears as the ancestor of enduring lines, even though his story begins in violence and dishonour. Oisin stands as one of the greatest poetic figures in Irish tradition and one of the central voices of the Fenian world. He was the son of Finn mac Cumhaill, and his mother was said in some stories to have borne him while in the shape of a doe. His name has been understood as meaning little deer, and that image of wild grace clings to him throughout the tradition. He is not remembered only as a warrior or only as a poet, but as both at once. Through him the pagan past speaks in song, memory, defiance and grief. The Fenian cycle, sometimes also called the Ossianic cycle, is deeply bound to his name. The historical frame of the Fenian tales begins with the Battle of Cnúcha and ends with the Battle of Gabhra, yet Oisin's own story extends beyond those events, because he survives the fall of the old heroic age. He passes into the otherworld and returns after 300 years, carrying with him a living memory of a vanished Ireland. This gives him a special place among legendary figures. He belongs both to the heroic age and to the world that came after it. Oisin appears in many Fenian stories beside Finn, Taoilte, Oscar, Conan Maol, and others of the Fianna. One of the greatest tales is the pursuit of Diarmuid and Grain. At the beginning of that story, Grain feels equal attraction toward both Oisin and Diarmuid. But because she is to be married to Finn, Oisin's father, she chooses instead to flee with Diarmuid. Oisin supports their escape, yet he also warns Diarmuid of Finn's power and cunning. The story becomes a tale of flight, pursuit, and constant movement across the landscape, and in later verse, Oisin recalls the old days of hunting, raiding, travel, and battle with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His voice belongs to a man who has seen power, youth, and glory, and who speaks from the far shore of old age. The lay that tells of his time in the land of youth presents one of the clearest visions of the pagan Irish paradise. In that story, Niamh arrives on a white horse beside a lake, where the Fianna are hunting and invites Oisin to accompany her to a land beyond the sea. She describes it as a place unmatched under the sun, rich with fruit, blossom and unwithering beauty. Oisin leaves Ireland with her, riding westward until they reach the kingdom of youth. On the way, he defeats a giant, and upon arrival he is given to Niamh as her companion forever by the ruler of that land. There he remains for 300 years and has children with her, living in a world where age does not touch the body and death has no claim. But memory draws him home. At last, he returns to Ireland riding the same white horse, and Niamh warns him not to set foot upon the ground, for if he does, all the years held back from him will fall at once. When he reaches Ireland, he finds the ancient places empty and overgrown. The great stronghold of the Fianna is silent. At Glenasmole, he tries to help a group of men lift a heavy stone onto a cart. As he bends to the task, the strap breaks, he falls, and the enchantment ends. In an instant he becomes a broken old man, while the white horse flees back to the other world without him. In his old age, Oisin meets St. Patrick, and their conversations become some of the most powerful dialogues in Irish tradition. Patrick represents the new faith and the new order, while Oisin speaks for the heroic pagan past. The saint is troubled by Oisin's constant praise of Finn and the Fianna, and by the old warrior's refusal to speak humbly of the Christian God. Oisin answers him with fierce loyalty to the world that shaped him. Again and again he declares that he would rather have Fionn and his companions alive in their strength than trade their memory for heavenly promises. In these exchanges, the old heroic code does not quietly fade away. It argues, resists, and stands its ground. Some poems present Oisin cursing hunger, weakness, and the thin life he believes has replaced the old days of bounty and courage. He remembers once commanding warriors who never knew want, and he contrasts that life with his own frailty in old age. In one tradition, Fionn had foretold that Oisin would one day be forced to carry stones for Patrick. Whether the story is told with pity or irony, it deepens the sense that the old world has been humbled but not silenced. Another poem from later tradition shows Oisin cold, isolated, and without feast, music, mead, or hunt. Even then, he remains above all a singer of lost greatness. He is also remembered as the poet of battle. The Battle of Gabra is attributed to him in tradition, and in such verses he speaks as one who was truly there, one who fought, hunted, slew, and endured. He remembers Ogham carved on stone, the dead lying around it, and the old heroic landscape still alive with meaning. In some late stories he leaves Patrick and is led to a pillar stone on the plain of Kildare, where weapons of Fionn are uncovered from the earth. In others he fights a black bull on Patrick's behalf, kills it, eats its flesh, and is found sleeping in the hide. He asks then to be buried facing east upon a mountain. More than one place claimed his grave, but wherever the body was said to rest, the spirit of Oisin remained active in memory as the voice of a heroic Ireland that refused to disappear. An Ollam was far more than a simple poet. He stood at the highest level of learning and professional attainment in early Irish society. In the poetic tradition, the Ollam was expected to master special forms of inspired knowledge and utterance, including sacred or difficult modes of composition, the power to receive insight, and the ability to improvise verse. But his role reached further. He preserved genealogies, historical traditions, the meanings of names, and the learned memory of the people. The knowledge expected of him fell into several broad areas. He had to know genealogies, synchronisms, and historical tales. He had to understand the different kinds of verse and the technical rules by which they were measured. He was also expected to judge poetry with authority and to recite verses with such mastery that they seemed to arise without preparation. The Ollam held a place at the king's court and often united the offices of poet, historian, teacher, and storyteller. His duty was to preserve the great tales in their accepted form and recite them at feasts and assemblies. He was expected to know at least a large portion of the traditional narratives of Ireland. The office lasted for centuries and remained visible into the 16th century. Even in that later period, observers noted that Irish lords kept around them historians, physicians, poets, and harpers, each supported by lands and privileges. Although the title is most often linked with poetry and history, it could also refer to mastery in other fields. One might speak of an Ollam builder or an Ollam of another craft, meaning the highest rank attainable in that art. The Ollam frequently taught students who lived under his guidance while working toward the same distinction. In some cases, their numbers were large enough to form a true school. Fees were paid for this instruction, and the relationship between master and pupil carried clear obligations. The teacher owed open instruction, correction without cruelty, and even food and clothing during the period of learning. The student, in turn, was expected to help support the Ollam in old age if need arose. At certain seasons, the Ollam and his pupils went on circuit, visiting kings and chiefs, performing their compositions and receiving hospitality and gifts. Some famous learned men were remembered as authorities on the earliest peoples of Ireland, including Partholon, Nemed, the Firbolg, and the Tuatha Dé Danann. Later poets carried the same tradition forward. One 13th century poet from Tyrone, belonging to the bardic family of Mac Con Midhe, became especially admired. Supported by great northern dynasties, he composed praise poems that remained in use for generations. In this way, the Olam tradition preserved not only old myths and histories, but also the living voice of political and cultural memory. The otherworld in Irish tradition was the realm of gods and spirits, known by many names that all suggest delight, promise, youth, life, or a shining plane beyond ordinary existence. One of its most vivid forms was the plane of honey or beauty reached across the sea, imagined as the golden track the sun lays upon the ocean between horizon and observer. In this sense, the road to the otherworld was also a road to eternity. The old belief held that the first ancestor of humankind was also the Lord of the Dead, and that this divine being dwelt in a far region beyond the western waters. Similar ideas appear elsewhere in Indo-European myth, where the blessed dead live at the edges of the earth near the deep rolling sea. Again and again, Irish stories describe the otherworld as a country across water, a place of inexhaustible food, timeless delight, and beings who can appear or remain unseen at will. In the stories of Bran, Connla, and Oisin, it is a Celtic paradise of beauty, love, and unending pleasure. Often the hero is called there by a woman from that realm, drawn not by terror but by desire, wonder, and promise. Later, Christian influence softened some of the more sensual features of this world, but the memory of it remained powerful. Voyages to the otherworld were known as sea journeys that carried their crews westward into the Atlantic beyond Ireland. In some respects, this realm resembles the warrior paradise of the north, where battle and glory continue beyond death. Some scholars believe that the western island imagined as the home of the dead may reflect an older geography, perhaps tied to the Isle of Man, long associated with Manannan, Lord of the Otherworld. If so, the idea may go back to a time when the western sea from Britain pointed directly toward mystery and divine presence. Yet the otherworld was not only overseas, it was also found beneath the Sidi, the ancient mounds and hills that were treated as dwellings of powerful beings. Even after the old gods faded from ordinary belief, memory of these places remained in stories of fairies and supernatural presences. Two elements seem to lie beneath this belief. One is the reverence given to striking natural features such as mountains and rivers, once imagined as alive with their own spirit. The other is the conviction that the Sida are homes of beings wiser and stronger than humankind. However it was located, the Irish pagan otherworld was most often a place of joy rather than punishment. It promised beauty, abundance, and freedom from decay. Folk tradition in Scotland preserved fragments of this older vision even into recent centuries. In prayers asking protection from fairy women, spirits of hill and glen, water beings, sorrow, and unseen forces. Though the names changed and the old religion faded, the sense of a nearby invisible realm never quite disappeared. One story tells of Connla, son of Conn, who is approached on the hill of Uisnich by a mysterious woman inviting him to the Plain of Delight. Before leaving, she gives him an apple on which he feeds for a month without ever reducing it. When she returns, she tells him of a land inhabited by women and maidens alone. Connla leaps into her shining boat, a glass-like vessel, and sails away forever. The people of that land live in an everlasting present, nourished by magical food, and those who go there do not come back. Another tale follows Cormac MacAirt, who encounters a grey-haired stranger on the hill of Tara carrying a silver branch hung with golden apples. The branch makes such sweet music that it can lull the sick, the wounded, and women in childbirth to sleep. The stranger says he comes from the land of truth. Cormac asks for the branch and receives it in exchange for 3 wishes. In the years that follow, his daughter, son, and wife are taken from him, one after another. When he pursues them through a mist, he emerges into the land of promise, where he is reunited with them and given a golden cup and the branch for comfort. His host later reveals himself as Manannan MacLear. When Cormac wakes, he is back once more at Tara. That land of promise was also said to hold the well of Sagais beneath its waters, the source of wisdom and hidden knowledge. Hazel trees grew around it, and their nuts dropped into the well, causing bubbles of inspiration to rise in the streams that flowed out. Every 7 years these nuts passed into the Boyne, and whoever ate them became a seer. In one strand of tradition, Fionn gained his wisdom through a salmon that had itself eaten one of those nuts. The otherworld here is not only a place of pleasure, but also the hidden storehouse of insight and poetic revelation. The voyage of Taj, son of Cian, also leads to strange islands and finally to the otherworld. Searching for people taken captive, he passes through marvel-filled places, including an island where eating the eggs of birds causes feathers to spring from the body. On another island, he meets a woman who tells him that many of the kings of Ireland dwell there. There, he sees Connla and the woman who lured him away, and there too stands the apple tree whose fruit first enchanted him. Tag eventually sails on, having spent a year in the otherworld without fully leaving the mortal tale behind. The adventures of Nera offer a darker entry into the same realm. On the night of Samain, during the reign of Medb and Ailill, a challenge is given to anyone bold enough to tie a twig around the foot of one of 2 hanged prisoners. Nera alone accepts. After repeated failure, he is guided by the dead man himself, who demands water. Carrying the corpse on his back in search of drink, Nera is drawn toward the Siheshi at Cú Chulainn. There he stays and is given a fairy wife. She warns him that the people of the Shire plan to attack Ailill's court at the next Samain, and when he asks for proof of his stay, she gives him fruits from that world. He returns and tells what he has seen, leading Medb and Ailill to attack the Sidihi itself. In this tale, the otherworld is not merely blissful. It is active, dangerous, and close enough to break into the human world at the turning of the year. Partholon was remembered as the leader of the first colony to reach Ireland after the flood. Tradition places his coming in a distant age, arriving from Greece with his wife, his 3 sons, and 1,000 followers. He landed in Donegal Bay and settled near Assaroe at Ballyshannon. Later, chroniclers tried to synchronize his arrival with figures from biblical and Eastern history, showing the old desire to fit Irish origins into a wider story of the ancient world. A verse associates him directly with conflict against the Fomorians on the plain, and some traditions even suggest that his own people may have been linked to the same broad stock. The settlers of Partholon were sometimes treated as a branch of the ancient peoples, who once held the Promised Land and spread westward along far coasts and islands. They were also associated with seafaring groups, whose name may reflect either piracy or a homeland of inlets and sea locks. Some later ideas imagined them as kin to peoples driven out from the eastern Mediterranean. In any case, Partholon was given the same eastern horizon that surrounds other early settlers of Ireland. His people later occupied the plain around Dublin between Tallaght, Clontarf and Howth. There, after centuries in Ireland, they were struck by plague and destroyed in a single devastating week. Tradition says that 9,000 died. Before that end, however, the first recorded battle in Irish history was placed in their time. Partholon's people fought 800 Fomorians under Cumhaill and his mother, Lot Luaimneach, near Lough Swilly in Donegal. The clash may reflect an old memory of conflict between related sea-born groups, rather than between entirely separate races. 4 years later, Partholon himself died in Leinster, and the first great chapter of settlement in Ireland came to an end under the shadow of plague and loss. At Samain, the hidden world was believed to stand open. Old tradition says that on this night the Sidhe of Ireland could no longer conceal their mysteries, and the barriers between the human world and the supernatural one grew thin. Samain marked the end of summer and the beginning of the dark half of the year. It was the night later remembered as Halloween, the eve before the first day of November. In popular belief, this was the time when spirits emerged from the ancient mounds and passed freely through the land. From the Sidhe at Cú Chulainn came terrifying beings and uncanny processions. The Ellen Treshen appeared, the Morrigan moved abroad, and ghostly hosts crossed the night sky, attended by copper-red birds and led by a monstrous three-headed vulture. Samakin wasn't imagined as a quiet, seasonal turning. It was a dangerous threshold when unseen powers could no longer be held back. It was also the season associated with the worship of Crom Cruach at Mag Slecht in what is now County Cavan. At this time of year, people sought to win the favour of a god tied to grain, fertility, and the harvest by means of devotion and sacrifice. Samain stood at the meeting point of fear and dependence. The crops had been gathered, winter approached, and survival through the cold months depended on both wise preparation and divine goodwill. Tribute was also closely linked to this season. One old payment was said to come to the King of Ulster from the Western Isles of Scotland, though that custom likely ended after the Battle of Magrath. Elsewhere, tributes were paid more generally to kings at this time. Samain therefore stood not only as a sacred turning in the year, but also as a moment of political order, payment, and public obligation. It brought together agriculture, kingship, and ritual in one powerful seasonal act. At Tara, the great royal assembly known as the Feis was traditionally held during Samain every third year. In later centuries, this custom may have narrowed so that it took place only at the beginning of a king's reign, but in memory it remained one of the most celebrated gatherings in ancient Ireland. The meeting began 3 days before Samain and lasted until 3 days after, creating a full week of feasting, ceremony, judgment, and display. Kings, lesser rulers, chiefs, and learned men came together in one place. The old festival left traces that survived long after the pagan structure around it had faded. Even later, Halloween customs seem to preserve echoes of that earlier gathering. Christian influence may have softened belief in spirits from the mounds, yet in parts of Ireland and Scotland, the older feeling remained alive. Fairies were still thought to travel on Samain night. Fires still blazed in towns and countryside. People still wore masks, feasted, and gathered around nuts and autumn fruits. Some of those masks may preserve something very ancient, perhaps forms once meant to recall animals, ancestors, or supernatural beings whose names survived in old descriptions. Fragments of verse collected in more recent centuries show how wild and theatrical these customs could still be. Figures dressed as devils moved from place to place, shouting comic and threatening rhymes, demanding money, and carrying clubs or household objects as mock weapons. In some districts, the devil was even accompanied by famous figures from history, transformed by folk imagination into part of the roaming Samain company. Beneath the laughter and performance, however, lay a much older pattern. Masks concealed the face, fires lit the darkness, and the village gave shape to fears that once belonged to the unseen world. Samain never entirely lost its edge. Even when turned into festivity, it retained the sense that something restless moved beyond the firelight. The season is also tied to one of the more vivid episodes involving the Dagda and the Fomorians. During Samain, The Dagda went to the enemy camp and was presented with a vast cauldron filled with milk, meal, fat, pigs, sheep, and goats, all boiled together into a grotesque feast. The Fomorians ordered him to consume it all, and he did so, though not willingly. The scene feels more than comic excess. It points to an offering made to the powers of earth and plenty at a critical time of year, when the community stood between harvest and winter. The Dagda's appetite in this story carries ritual weight, as though divine consumption seals the relationship between land, food, and survival. After this feast, the Dagda is said to have lain with the daughter of Indech, and elsewhere he is linked in similar fashion with Boand and with the Morrigan. This union of god and goddess seems deeply connected with Samhain. The season was not only about death, fear, or spirits crossing into the world of the living. It was also a time of fertility rites, renewal, and sacred coupling. In myth, the meeting of the Dagda and the Morrigan reflects a larger idea that power over the land required both masculine and feminine force joined together. Samhain, for all its darkness, was also a season of possibility. It marked the death of one cycle and the conception of another. Many stories tied to Samhain follow the same pattern. The otherworld attacks first, pressing in upon human life, and only then do mortals answer back. One of the best examples is Eilean mac Midna, who came every Samhain to burn Tara, until he was finally killed by Fionn. Fire appears again and again in these tales, but so does water. Houses are set ablaze, victims are drowned, and ritual death takes place through both flame and flood. Ancient writers connected similar customs with gods in Gaul, where one deity was appeased by drowning victims in a vat, and another by burning them inside a wooden frame. Whether these reports preserve exact ritual or not, they reflect the same grim atmosphere that surrounds Samhain in Irish tradition. It was a season of sacrifice, fertility, dread, and confrontation with powers larger than ordinary life. In the old imagination, the supernatural at Samhain could be generous, but it could also be terrifying. Scathach belongs to a different part of the legendary world, yet she too stands close to the boundary between human life and the otherworld. She is remembered as a female warrior, almost an Amazon, associated especially with the Western Isles of Scotland and most of all with Skye. She was a teacher of combat and one of the great trainers of heroes. Cú Chulainn travelled to her in order to complete his preparation for war, and the traditions surrounding that journey show that her school was no ordinary place of instruction. To force her to teach him everything she knew, he is said to have leapt upon her and threatened her with his sword. Once accepted as her student, however, he fought on her behalf against her enemies. In return, she granted him 3 precious things. She promised to train him thoroughly, to give him her daughter without demanding a bride price, and to reveal what kind of future awaited him. Among the deadly skills Cú Chulainn learned from Scathach were the Gai Bolga and the Thunder Feet, both of them famous marks of his warrior identity. Yet Scathach is more than a trainer of battle technique. She is often treated as an otherworld woman, a powerful female figure whose gifts resemble those offered by mysterious women in many heroic traditions. Her giving of weapons recalls other stories in which a hero receives a sacred blade or gift from a supernatural woman connected with water, island, or hidden realm. The pattern is clear. The hero does not become complete through strength alone. He must pass through initiation under the authority of a woman who belongs partly or wholly to another world. The tales around Scathach grow even more striking in the story of her conflict with Aife. Cú Chulainn defeated Aife in battle and forced her to promise hostages and submission, so that she would never again stand against Scathach. He also spent the night with her, and from that union a son was born who was later to come to Ireland. At the same time, Cú Chulainn is linked not only with Aife, but also with Scathach's daughter, Uathach, and with Scathach herself. In the old stories, martial training, sexuality, and initiation are closely intertwined. The apprentice hero does not merely learn a craft, he enters a relationship with the force behind that craft. The female warrior of the otherworld becomes part teacher, part lover, and part gateway into heroic identity itself. This gives the Scathach stories a depth that goes far beyond simple combat training. They suggest that mastery required total transformation. Scota belongs to the great legendary genealogies that tried to explain where the Irish came from and how the island received one of its oldest names. In one tradition, she is the mother of the sons of Mill, and from her the island was called Scotia. Other traditions connect the name instead with Scythia and with peoples believed to have come from that region. The stories vary, but all of them reveal the same desire to place Ireland within a wider, ancient world stretching from Egypt to Spain and beyond. According to legend, the first Irish ancestor was a Scythian named Phineas Farsaid. He settled in Egypt, and his son married a daughter of the pharaoh. Their line eventually produced Scota, and from her line came the ancestors of the Gaels. In this way, the traditions tie together the names Scot, Gael, and other old ethnic identities within a single grand family story. Scota herself is said to have left Egypt after her people were forced to depart, when they refused to support the oppression of the children of Israel. After wandering through parts of North Africa for many years, she eventually came to Spain. Through stories like this, Irish tradition gave its own people an origin not in one place alone, but across a long sacred geography of exile, migration, and destiny. Scota also remained connected in folklore with places in Kerry, showing how a figure of legendary migration could be rooted firmly in local memory and landscape. The figures known as Sheila na Gigs form another mysterious strand in the cultural memory of Ireland, Britain, and France. These carvings show naked female figures facing outward, legs spread, hands pulling open the vulva. The form is direct, unsettling, and difficult to interpret with certainty. The older Irish name has been linked to a phrase meaning "sile of the breasts," and later, dictionaries described such figures as stone fertility objects, though the explanation is far from settled. Most are found on castles and churches, especially structures dating from the 12th to the 16th centuries. They also appear on round towers, bridges, wells, walls, and standing stones. Ireland holds the greatest number, with especially strong concentrations in Tipperary, Cork, Offaly, Clare, and Meath. Scholars have long struggled to explain these carvings. Some see them as guardians placed on buildings to ward off evil. Others view them as fertility images that preserve traces of older pagan beliefs beneath medieval Christian stonework. Their exact meaning remains uncertain, but the persistence of the form suggests that later carvers were drawing on ideas already old, by their own time. Some earlier stone figures in Ireland resemble the later Sheilas, closely enough to suggest a long development from pre-Christian imagery into medieval, religious, and secular settings. Figures from Boa Island, White Island, and Tara are often brought into this discussion because they seem to stand at an earlier stage of the same visual tradition. This raises an important question. To what extent were medieval sculptors consciously drawing from the pagan past? The answer is still unclear, but some examples hint strongly at continuity. A figure from Saor Ciaran has been described as deeply rooted in the older Celtic world. Some carvings also contain drilled holes whose purpose remains unknown. The connection with the Cumhaill, the old hag of sovereignty myth, comes naturally to mind. In Irish tradition, the future king often had to accept and mate with a hideous old woman before she transformed into a beautiful young sovereign. In that sense, female power, fertility, kingship, and unsettling bodily imagery all belong to the same mythic landscape. Certain carved discs or stone balls also appear near some Síle figures, adding another layer of ritual or symbolic mystery. Whatever their final meaning, Síle na gigs remain among the most haunting survivals of old sacred imagery in stone. Sior Galumhai belongs to Highland tradition, especially in Tiri and South Uist, where he appears as a radiant and heroic being connected with the sun and with the otherworld. He is said to be the son-in-law of the lord of that hidden realm, and his beloved is the queen of the Isle of Women. In one tale, he rescues a lady from a giant lord who can be killed only by his own weapon. Tradition has often compared him with Sir Gawain, suggesting that beneath later romance there may survive an older heroic and solar figure whose roots reach back into Celtic myth. Slainge stands near the beginning of Fir Bolg rule in Ireland. He and his 4 brothers, all sons of Dela, divided the island into 5 parts after their people took possession of the land. Slainge landed at the mouth of the Slaney and received Leinster as his portion, stretching from the mouth of the Boyne to the harbour at Waterford. The group associated with him were the Gallioin. His reign as king lasted only 1 year, and at its end he died at Dinrig on the River Barrow, a place also remembered as the Mound of Slainge. Other tradition places his death and burial at Slane beneath a great mound that gave the hill its name. However the details vary, he is remembered as the first of the Fir Bolg leaders to die in Ireland, and that gave his story a particular weight in the sequence of early settlements. At the centre of early Irish kingship stands the sovereignty myth, one of the most powerful patterns in the whole tradition. The idea is simple and profound. Kingship did not belong fully to a man unless it was granted by the goddess of the land. Sovereignty itself was imagined as female. Without her acceptance, no king was truly legitimate. The myth often takes the form of a young man meeting an old and hideous woman in a lonely place. He agrees to lie with her, and in response she transforms into a radiant young woman and grants him rule. Later in life, the pattern may reverse. The king meets a beautiful young woman, lies with her, and she turns old again and destroys him. The message is unmistakable. Sovereignty is not permanently possessed. It is bestowed, withdrawn, and bound to a power older than any king. In some visions, the sovereignty figure appears enthroned in splendour, crowned in gold and seated upon crystal, holding a vat of red drink and serving each successive ruler from a golden cup. In others, she first appears in a revolting form. One famous tale tells of brothers who encounter such a hag, so hideous that they would rather be buried alive than look at her. She demands that one of them sleep with her, or else she will devour them all. Only one agrees for the sake of the others, and as the firelight falls upon her, she changes into dazzling beauty. Her eyes shine with sunlight, and her body fills the room with radiance. In return, she prophesies greatness, kingship, and inspired gifts for the man who accepted her. The union between king and sovereignty was known as the woman feast, the sacred marriage at inauguration. All the goddesses could be seen as forms of sovereignty, but the highest among them was often Eriu, the mother figure of the island itself. Some scholars have argued that these goddesses were originally connected with the sun as well as with earth, rivers, and springs. The ritual behind the myth may preserve very ancient fertility patterns in which the harmony of land, sky, moon, and sun had to be renewed through sacred ceremony. Even in later centuries, traces of this idea endured. Poets could still speak of a king as the spouse of the land, and Ireland itself as a lawful bride joined to rightful rulers. Early legal scholars also recognised that kingship in Ireland had once been sacred in the deepest sense, tied to ancestral deities and old inauguration rites that survived in weakened form long into the historical period. Sualdam mac Roich, appears in tradition as the foster father and often the father of Cú Chulainn. The stories surrounding his son's conception are varied and strange. In one version, Cú Chulainn's mother swallows a tiny insect during her wedding feast, and later Lug appears to her in a dream and reveals that it was he who entered her in that form. Another story says she was already pregnant before being betrothed to Sualdam, ended that pregnancy out of shame, and then conceived again by him. As with many heroic births, the uncertainty itself marks the child as extraordinary. Sualdam belongs to the kingdom of Cooley in what is now County Louth, and tradition places him in the same broad heroic age as Fergus and the kings of Ulster. His authority included rights over cattle in Cooley and the district of Muirthemne, and this may reflect an older political order, separate in some respects from the core kingdom of Ulster. One sign of this appears in the Great Cattle Raid, where neither Sualdam nor Cú Chulainn is affected by the weakness that falls upon the Ulaid. Sualdam is also said to have tested Cú Chulainn's valour in an early challenge that preserved the honour of Ulster's warriors. Some have seen in this episode an especially ancient relationship, in which the hero stands to a magician or ritual father in the same way a son stands to his parent. During the Great Cattle Raid, Sualdam rides to Emain Macha on Cú Chulainn's horse to awaken the warriors who lie helpless under their mysterious weakness. He cries out that men are being slaughtered, women taken captive, and cattle driven away. But no one answers because the order of speech at court prevents any response. The king may not speak before the druids, and the men may not speak before the king. When Sualdam repeats his desperate warning to Cathbad, he is dismissed. Furious, he turns away, but in the chaos, his own shield edge cuts off his head as the horse rears. Then the horse races through Emain Macha, carrying the severed head, still crying the same words of alarm. Only then are the men of Ulster stirred to action. It is one of the most vivid scenes in the cycle, and it gives Sualdam a death at once grotesque, tragic, and unforgettable. Suibhne Gailt belongs partly to history and partly to legend. He is remembered as a 7th century ruler of the Dal Naraide, and his story is tied to the Battle of Mag Rath. That battle was fought between Cumhaill, king of the Ulaid, and Domhnall, king of Ireland. Suibhne supported Cumhaill along with forces from Scotland, while the clerics backed Domhnall and cursed both Cumhaill and Suibhne. His arrival at the battle is described with royal brightness, his yellow banner raised over him and his youthful beauty still visible in the midst of war. But the terror of battle broke him. The sights and sounds shattered his mind, and panic turned him into a creature of trembling flight. Tradition says the strength of his brain was destroyed by the roaring of combat. Another strand of the story places the cause of his madness in a curse laid upon him by St. Ronan after a conflict over a church. In that version, Suibhne had entered the church naked, thrown the psalter into a lake, and assaulted the priest before being summoned to battle. The curse doomed him to wander naked until killed by a spear. Whether that detail was original or later, the turning point remains the same. At Mag Rath, he leaps in terror from shield to tree, maddened further by the shouting of onlookers and the recognition of both armies. Then hail falls, and he vanishes from human company into the wilderness. From that moment, he becomes the great wanderer of Irish story, living in trees, feeding on water and cress, and roaming from place to place in a state of Geltacht, wild madness. The tale of his wandering is one of the most powerful works of early Irish literature because it combines mental anguish with an intense love of landscape. Suibhne laments his own condition even as he praises woods, glens, rivers, mountains, and birdsong. He becomes almost a creature of nature, more at home in branches than among men. the cries of birds, the voices of stags, the whiteness of frost, the winds of winter, and the long roads across Ireland and Scotland all become part of his inner life. He is mad, but his madness gives him a strange clarity. He sees beauty where others hear only loneliness. He travels widely, lingering at places in Antrim, Kerry, Galway, Sligo, and even on islands off the Scottish coast. He speaks of cold, frost, rough snow, and nights sustained only by what he can gather with his own hands. For a time he settles near Tech Moling, where the cleric Moling takes pity on him and has milk left out each day so he may drink it secretly. But jealousy intervenes. A spear is thrown at him while he stoops over the milk, and it passes through his body, killing him. His death is followed by a final exchange of verses in which Sweben recalls how once he preferred the sounds of birds, bells, and mountain life to human voices. He is then buried beneath a cairn of stones, and the memory of him survives as that of a king, a madman, and a poet of the wild. Tuatha Dé Danann is remembered as a figure of the land itself. Sometimes she is described as the daughter of the Great Plain, sometimes in other terms, but always in close connection with the earth and with place. She was the wife of Eochu, the last king of the Firbolg, and she became foster mother to Lug, son of Cian. Tuatha Dé Danann lived at the place that still bears her name, Telltown in County Meath. There, she and her people cleared the forest of Cumhaill, uprooting the trees and making way for the fertile plain that later became one of the richest parts of Ireland. In this, Tuatha Dé Danann follows a pattern seen with several goddesses of the land whose memory is fixed in the names of regions and sacred places. The labour of clearing the forest was said to have caused her death. As she lay dying, she asked that funeral games be held every year in her honour on the plain she had won from the woods. Lug fulfilled that wish, establishing games that lasted for a fortnight around the beginning of August. These included contests, horse races, feats of skill, and ceremonial gatherings, all bound to mourning and remembrance. The ancient assembly held there became known as the Oenach Tailten. The place remained famous for centuries, and even in later times, great fairs were still held there, drawing people from across Ireland and from Scotland as well. Marriage customs formed part of the gathering, with unions made in a place remembered as the marriage hollow. Tuatha Dé Dannann's memory therefore lived not only in mourning and myth, but also in festivity, courtship, and the life of the people. The word Taín means a cattle raid, and cattle raiding was once central to Irish heroic society. It was a serious act of wealth-taking, prestige, and war, and its importance continued in some form almost into modern times. The most famous of all such stories is the Táin Bó Cúailnge, but other cattle raids also survive in tradition, often serving as background stories leading into the great epic. One tale tells of Frech crossing vast distances to recover both stolen cattle and his wife, journeying from Ulster through Scotland and onward toward continental Europe. Another tells of a raid connected with Dartaid, daughter of a king on the Shannon, in which she fought fiercely, but was eventually carried off with her cattle and died as a result. Yet another concerns Flidais, who was taken with her great herds after battle, and whose wealth later served to feed armies. These stories show that the raid was not only theft, it was a test of honour, force, and status, often centred on women as well as livestock. The Táin Bó Cúailnge stands above them all. Set in the age of Medb and Ailill, rulers of Comnost, it survives in many manuscripts and remains the great epic of pre-Christian Ireland. The world it depicts is pastoral and warlike, filled with taboos, severed heads, chariots, and richly adorned warriors. At its centre stands Medb's desire for the great black bull of Cooley, a beast charged with supernatural fertility and enormous symbolic power in a cattle-based society. The struggle is told as a war between Connaught and Ulster, with the raiders moving from west to east, though some have argued that it reflects an even broader rivalry for supremacy in ancient Ireland. However it is read, the story clearly preserves memories of political ambition, regional tension, and heroic ideals stretching back into the Iron Age imagination. The tale unfolds through great sequences of mustering, single combats, reversals, awakenings, and final destruction. It begins with preparation and movement, continues through Cú Chulainn's feats and lonely defence against the invading host, and ends with the great battles and with the deaths of the two mighty bulls. In that ending, the white-horned bull of Medby and the dark bull of Cooley destroy one another, and the conflict closes not in simple triumph, but in exhaustion and mutual ruin. The cattle raid becomes a story about kingship, pride, supernatural force, and the terrible cost of desire. Tara rises above the plain of Meath as one of the most important places in ancient Irish memory. About 6 miles southeast of Navan, the hill stands around 500 feet above sea level, and has long been regarded as the ceremonial centre of Ireland. It was the seat of kings from the earliest remembered times until the 6th century, but it was more than a royal residence. Tara was a ritual landscape, a place where tribal gatherings were held, where divine ancestors were remembered in mounds, and where kings and chiefs assembled in moments of danger, war, and public importance. It was the symbolic heart of the island. The Fais of Tara was held there at Samain, usually every 3rd year, bringing together rulers from across Ireland for a 7-day festival, stretching 3 days before and 3 days after the turning point of the year. On special occasions when a high king had to be chosen, the old bull feast was performed. The kings of Tara have often been described as priest kings, and the duties placed upon them suggest a close connection with ritual and perhaps with solar worship. The repeated burning of Tara by Éilinn at Samain may reflect more than legend alone. It may preserve a memory of sacred fire rites. Another old rule forbade the lighting of fires elsewhere until the druids had first kindled the ceremonial flame at Tara. In this way, the hill controlled not only politics, but also the ritual life of the island. Early descriptions of Tara speak of wells, streams, forts, mounds, sacred stones, and great enclosures. One well lay near an elf mound in the northeast, and from it flowed a stream linked to the first mill in Ireland, said to have been made for Cormac's servant woman. Nearby stood the king's fort, associated with Cormac and with the high seat. Tees Rampart was also remembered there, and some said that the name of Tara itself came from her, linking the place to an earth goddess. The mound of the cow lay west of the mound of hostages, while the famous stone of Fal stood near that mound. This was the stone said to cry out beneath the feet of the rightful king when he took possession of Ireland. Other places on the hill were tied to heroes and ancient dead, including the site of Cú Chulainn's shield and the burial place of Logair with his shield of valour. One of the most striking old descriptions concerns the great house known later as the banqueting hall. It was remembered as a long structure with 14 doors, 7 on each side, large enough to hold the chosen men of Ireland. There, the feast of Tara was said to have taken place. The hall was described as containing the whole social order in miniature. Every profession and rank had its proper position. Horsemen, harpers, judges, poets, hunters, charioteers, historians and builders all had assigned places according to status and function. In this vision, Tara becomes more than a royal site. It becomes a model of society itself, ordered, ranked, and set in ceremonial form before the king. Modern scholars are not certain that such a hall ever stood there in exactly the way tradition describes. Some believe the account reflects the imagination of later learned writers, trying to project their own knowledge of hierarchy back onto the ancient hill. Others think the long earthwork was not a hall at all, but a grand avenue into the royal enclosure, or perhaps a place for races and public spectacle. Even if the detail shifted over time, the importance of Tara did not. Like Eilech in Donegal and Emain Macha in Armagh, it combines commanding views, impressive earthworks, and the unmistakable marks of former greatness. The hill still carries the memory of kingship, assembly, ritual, and myth. In the imagination of Ireland, Tara remained not merely a place on the landscape, but the ancient centre from which power, ceremony, and story once radiated. In early Ireland, kingship was not decided only by force, inheritance, or agreement. There existed an older and more mysterious method, one rooted in ritual, sacrifice, and vision. This was the bull feast. The rite began with the killing of a white bull. Its flesh was cooked, and one chosen man ate until he was completely satisfied, drinking the broth as well. Once filled, he lay down to sleep. Around him stood druids, chanting incantations meant to reveal truth. What followed was not ordinary dreaming. In that heavy sleep, a vision came, and within that vision appeared the figure of the future king. The dream did not merely suggest a candidate. It revealed him. When the dreamer awoke, he described what he had seen, and from that description the identity of the rightful ruler was determined. This ceremony was believed to have been carried out at Tara, and it endured for centuries. Through it, figures such as Conair Mór and Lugade of the Red Stripes were chosen. The striking feature of the rite is its reliance on vision rather than politics. The dream held authority over the will of provinces and kings. Even when powerful groups opposed a candidate, the result of the ritual could override their agreement. The choice of king came not from debate, but from what was revealed in the unseen world. Dreams, in this sense, were not personal fantasies. They were treated as a channel through which truth itself could speak. The importance given to such visions shows how deeply early Irish society trusted the supernatural as a guide to order and legitimacy. Yet this system did not survive unchanged. With the spread of Christianity, practices involving sacrifice and divination were condemned. The bull feast, with its ritual killing and its invocation of hidden forces, was eventually suppressed. It passed from living tradition into memory, leaving behind only the idea that kingship once depended on more than human judgment. Among the figures who stand between legend and early history is Tigermas, remembered as a king of Ireland in a distant age long after the first arrivals of the Milesians. He is said to have ruled for 77 years, and his story places him firmly within the mythological cycle. Like figures in other ancient cultures who stand at the beginning of civilization, he is credited with introducing major advancements. Tradition remembers him as the first Irish king to work gold. He is also said to have established distinctions of rank through clothing, assigning different colours to different classes of society. Under his rule, goldsmiths shaped ornaments, and precious metals became part of both status and display. Even dyes for coloured garments were said to have been discovered during his time, marking a shift toward a more refined and structured society. His reign is also filled with accounts of warfare. He is credited with victories across Ireland, from Limerick to Sligo, from Cork to Kerry. Battles were fought in wooded lands, near rivers, and along coasts. He is described as a relentless and successful warrior, expanding his influence through repeated conflict. Yet alongside these victories appear strange and unsettling events. During his reign, lakes are said to have burst forth suddenly across the land, and dark rivers emerged where none had existed before. These events carry the tone of myth rather than record, suggesting a world where natural forces and royal power were closely intertwined. Teigenmass met his end in a manner that reflects both ritual and catastrophe. He died at Mag Slecht during a time of worship directed toward Crom Cruach, a central figure in ancient belief. The moment of his death came at Samain, the same threshold when the boundary between worlds was believed to weaken. It is said that 3/4 of the people of Ireland died alongside him, struck down in a sudden disaster often described as a plague. After his death, the land was left without a king for years, and the destruction spread further among the people. His story combines innovation, power, and tragedy, ending in a scene where devotion to a god becomes inseparable from mass death. One of the most powerful and complete narratives from early Irish tradition is the tale known as the destruction of Dederga's hostel. It belongs to a larger group of stories and centres on the fate of Conaire Mór, a king whose rise and fall follow the pattern of destiny shaped by taboos. The story begins before his birth, with the meeting of a king and a woman of the supernatural world. She is encountered beside water, her hair loosened as she tends to it, holding a golden comb. She offers herself in marriage under the condition that refusal means death. Their union produces a daughter, and through a chain of events involving abandonment and rescue, that daughter grows up in obscurity among herdsmen. In this humble setting, she is visited by a being who sheds the form of a bird and takes on human shape. He tells her she will bear a son, and that this child must never harm birds. This becomes one of the defining taboos of the boy who will be named Conaire. Raised as the son of a king, he grows into a figure marked by both royal status and supernatural origin. When the time comes to choose a new ruler, the bull feast is performed, and the dream reveals a strange image. A man carrying a stone in a sling appears in the vision, and this figure is identified as Conaire. His path to kingship is not simple. While travelling, he encounters birds unlike any others. When he pursues them, they transform into armed figures and confront him. One among them reveals his identity and reminds him of his taboo. From that moment, Conaire accepts his role and proceeds to Tara, where he is recognised and crowned. Along with his kingship come a series of restrictions placed upon him. These taboos are not symbolic. They are binding conditions, and as long as he obeys them, his reign is secure. For a time, his rule is marked by order and strength. Yet the structure holding his fate together begins to weaken as he breaks one restriction after another. Each small violation brings him closer to disaster. His final journey leads him to a hostel, a place that becomes the stage for his destruction. Before he arrives, strange figures appear, including riders clothed in red, both men and horses alike, who claim to be both living and dead. Their presence signals that the balance of the world has already shifted. At the hostel, Conaire encounters a woman who warns him that no one within will escape alive. She carries many names, each linked to powers of war and earth, and her presence confirms that fate has already closed around him. Despite knowing that admitting a woman after sunset breaks one of his taboos, he allows her to enter. This final breach seals his doom. Outside, enemies gather, including exiled warriors and raiders who return with a foreign leader. They surround the hostel and prepare for attack. The assault unfolds with intensity and detail. Fires are set and extinguished. Warriors clash, and the defenders struggle to hold their ground. Within, descriptions of the inhabitants reveal a vivid and almost surreal scene. Warriors, giants, and craftsmen occupy different chambers, each portrayed with striking imagery. The tension builds as the attackers close in. Eventually, thirst overtakes Conaire, a supernatural weakness imposed upon him. While one of his champions leaves to find water, the enemies break through. In the final moment, Conaire is killed, his head severed as the defenders fall around him. When his champion returns, he finds the king already dead. in a gesture that blends horror with loyalty. He pours water into the severed head, which speaks once more, praising his courage. The scene captures the essence of the tale, where life and death, loyalty and inevitability exist side by side. Conair's fall is not merely the result of battle. It is the consequence of broken taboos, of destiny unfolding step by step until it can no longer be avoided. The story has often been interpreted as more than myth. Beneath its supernatural elements lies a pattern that resembles historical conflict. A king of one group is defeated in a region controlled by another, and the tale preserves that event in symbolic form. Whether read as history, transformed into legend, or as pure narrative shaped by belief, it remains one of the most powerful accounts of fate in Irish tradition. At the centre of much of this mythology stand the Tuatha Dé Danann, a people described not simply as human, but as beings of power, knowledge, and magic. They are associated with a great mother figure, a goddess connected to fertility and the nurturing force of the land. Their arrival in Ireland is placed among a series of ancient invasions, and they are often described as coming from distant lands where they learned druidic arts, prophecy, and supernatural skill. Different traditions describe their coming in different ways. In one version, they arrive through the air, hidden in dark clouds, using their mastery of magic. In another, they come by sea and burn their ships upon landing, ensuring that they cannot return. These images are sometimes combined, suggesting that their arrival was surrounded by smoke and mist, concealing them from enemies. Once in Ireland, they defeat earlier inhabitants and establish their rule, bringing with them powerful objects that symbolize their mastery. These include a stone that recognizes kings, a spear that cannot be resisted, a sword that never fails, and a cauldron that provides endless sustenance. Their greatest conflict is with the Fomorians, a rival force often associated with chaos and destructive power. The battle between them represents more than a simple struggle for land. It reflects a deeper contrast between order and disorder, light and darkness. In that battle, leaders fall and new ones rise. Nuadu is killed, Ogma also falls, and Lug emerges as the new king. Through him, the Tuatha Dé Danann secure victory, though their rule is not eternal. Eventually, they are defeated by the Milesians, a later group of invaders. Rather than vanishing entirely, the Tuatha Dé Danann withdraw into the earth, taking up residence beneath the hills and mounds scattered across Ireland. Each god or figure claims a domain, ruling from hidden places beneath the land. Over time, they become the beings remembered in folklore as the people of the mounds, the fair folk who exist alongside the human world but remain unseen. Their presence continues in later stories, where they appear as protectors, guides, or forces of war. They are tied to specific landscapes, with particular hills and sites, associated with individual figures. Through these connections, the land itself becomes a map of memory, each place holding a trace of divine presence. In this way, the Tuatha Dé Danann do not disappear. They transform, becoming part of the invisible structure of the world, shaping stories, belief, and imagination long after their age has passed. Tuatha Techtmar stands at the edge of recorded history, a figure whose story carries more of the weight of reality than many others in the same tradition. His name suggests a ruler of the people, and his reign is placed in the early centuries of the first millennium. According to tradition, his father was killed in a revolt, and his mother fled while pregnant. He was raised abroad and later returned with a force of followers, landing on the coast and gathering support among local groups. He defeated his enemies and established himself as king, bringing unity where there had been division. Some accounts portray him as an outsider, possibly connected with foreign forces, who imposed order through conquest. He is credited with reorganizing the land, creating the central region of Meath, by taking portions from surrounding territories. This new kingdom included important gathering places, such as Tara, Uisneach, and others, forming a political and symbolic centre for the island. Though some details of his life remain uncertain, his story reflects a shift toward more structured kingship and territorial control. He represents a moment where legend begins to blend into history, where myth gives way to a clearer sense of political change. Uisneach, another key site in this landscape, was regarded as the centre of Ireland. It stood as a meeting point where the provinces were believed to converge. A great stone marked this division, symbolising unity within separation. The hill was also a major place of assembly, particularly during the festival of early summer, when fires were lit in honour of a powerful figure associated with light and renewal. These fires were not merely symbolic. Cattle were driven between them as a form of protection, and rituals were carried out under strict ceremony. The hill's position allowed its fires to be seen across great distances, and from it, light could spread outward to other regions. Archaeological work has uncovered large deposits of ash, suggesting repeated burning over long periods. Whether or not it served as a royal residence, its importance as a ritual centre is clear. It was a place where the sacred and the practical met, where fire, land, and community were brought together in shared acts. Across these stories, places like Tara and Uisneach stand as anchors, holding together a world where kingship, ritual, and belief were inseparable. The land itself carries the memory of these traditions, shaping the stories that continue to be told long after the rituals themselves have faded.